down. Looks like 6, 7 floors, and there's more explosions right now. Hold on, people are running.
Hold on just a moment. We've got an explosion inside.
The building's exploding right now. You got people running up the street.
Okay.
I believe in the building at the time. Steve, what?
But then there is a fire and an explosion about 20 stories further down. I was at the base of the building when it happened. There was one huge bang and the building...
Terrorist attacks can shake the foundations of our biggest buildings, but they cannot touch the foundation of America. America was targeted for attack because we're the brightest beacon for freedom and opportunity in the world, and no one will keep that light from shining. The enemy of America is not our many Muslim friends. It is not our many Arab friends. Our enemy is a radical network of terrorists and every government that supports them. Our war on terror begins with Al-Qaeda, but it does not end there. It will not end until every terrorist group of global reach has been found, stopped, and defeated. Either you are with us or you are with the terrorists.
Who are these people? Where did they come from? Why are they obsessed with the West? Did they just wake up one day, quote a verse from the Quran, and decide to hijack planes? It's the myth we've been fed, that Islam, particularly political Islam, is inherently violent, that it breeds extremism like a bad batch of yogurt, that radical Islam is something ancient, pre-modern, born in the deserts of Arabia and stubbornly hostile to progress. That's the official story. Now let's talk about the real one. Because before America met Osama, before ISIS hashtags went viral, before Guantanamo, Predator drones, or CIA black sites, the West already had its fingerprints all over what we now call radical Islam. This isn't a conspiracy theory. This is the part of the story they always leave out in the Netflix docs. If you listen to Western pundits long enough, you'd think the words Islam and politics are a Molotov cocktail just waiting to go off. Political Islam must be terrorism. Islamic law must be the Taliban. A Muslim talking about government must be plotting something in a cave. But let's take a breath and rewind. Back to a world before CIA supplied AK-47s and jihadist TikToks. Islam has been political since day one. The year is 610 CE. Mecca is a religious oligarchy. Tribalism is gospel. Power is inherited. Idols fill the Kaaba. And then, a man, alone in a cave, receives a revelation. This man was called Muhammad, and the revelation he received? Read in the name of your Lord who created. This is the birth of Islam. But it's not the birth of a death cult. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, wasn't preaching rage. He wasn't calling for suicide operations. He was calling for moral reform, economic justice, compassion, honesty in trade, protection of orphans, the dignity of women, the rights of slaves. He openly challenged the Quraysh elite, not through violence, but through message. And they hit back. Boycotts, torture, assassinations, propaganda. For 13 years in Mecca, he never lifted a sword. Only after forced migration to Medina in 622 did he establish a city-state. And what a state it was. Not theocracy, not dictatorship, not cult rule. The Constitution of Medina, the first written pluralist pact in the region, granted legal autonomy to Jews, protected religious freedom, and recognized non-Muslim tribes as equal citizens. They are one nation, Ummah, with the Muslims, it said. And when conflict arose, the Prophet, peace be upon him, enforced rules of warfare radically different from anything the 7th century world had seen. No killing women, children, or non-combatants, no mutilation, no burning of trees, poisoning of wells, or destruction of homes. Prisoners of war were fed before Muslims ate. In a region soaked in vengeance culture, Islam demanded restraint. This was Political Islam 1.0. Spiritual, ethical, legally accountable, and deeply humane. And crucially, when power consolidated, the Prophet, peace be upon him, didn't crown himself emperor for life. He died on a mud floor. No palace, no army surrounding him. And his last words weren't, take revenge, or spread Islam by the sword. They were, be mindful of your prayer, be just to your subordinates. When he passed away in 632 CE, his followers didn't descend into holy war or cultish terror. They elected a leader, Abu Bakr, who declared one of the first principles of Islamic governance. Obey me so long as I obey God and his messenger, but if I disobey, you owe me no loyalty. That's not ISIS rhetoric. That's something Thomas Jefferson would have plagiarized if he spoke Arabic. And thus, with his election, the caliphate was born. But not everyone was happy. Some tribes refused to pay zakat, others tried to break off. Abu Bakr responded, decisively. The Ridda Wars followed, a campaign to preserve unity, not to spread religion by the sword. Modern extremists, like ISIS and Al-Qaeda, frequently invoke the Ridda Wars as supposed justification for waging war on Muslims who abandon aspects of Islam today. But this is a gross distortion of both history and legal context. The Ridda Wars weren't about theological disagreement or personal sins. They were a response to a political rebellion and the disintegration of a newly unified state. The early Muslim community viewed zakat not just as charity, but as a civic obligation, and those tribes had effectively seceded from the nascent political order. Abu Bakr didn't declare them kafir for poor religious practice. He treated them as insurgents. Modern jihadists twist this into a license to kill anyone who doesn't submit to their narrow version of Islam, completely ignoring the legal, political, and ethical nuance the early Muslims actually employed. After Abu Bakr came Umar, who built a state bureaucracy, expanded the Islamic realm to unprecedented territorial extent, and offered a model for leadership that Muslims still aspire to. There's wealth, new lands, converts flooding in, and with growth comes tension. It was after Umar's assassination that the cracks began to show. His successor, Usman, who canonized the Quran, faced potent opposition due to his administration, not because he abandoned Islam, but because his policies were misunderstood, exploited by agitators, and framed as betrayal. Usman was accused of nepotism, of placing Umayyad relatives in key posts. Rebellions stirred in Egypt and Kufa. The complaints weren't new, but this time they weren't just grumbling. A group of rebels laid siege to his house in Medina. He was murdered while reciting the Quran, unarmed and in his 80s. Boom. First major political fracture in Islamic history. This wasn't just a coup, it was a spiritual trauma. And this trauma became fertile ground for religious Puritans and political opportunists. After Usman's assassination, the Muslims chose Ali as the fourth caliph. Ali, cousin of the Prophet, peace be upon him, husband of his daughter, Fatima, father of his grandchildren, Hassan and Hussein, was revered for his knowledge, piety, and justice. But he inherited a burning house, only to find himself surrounded by enemies who would weaponize piety, split the Ummah, and eventually birth the first true extremists, the Kharijites. Upon the succession of Ali, the Umayyads, led by Muawiyah, governor of Syria and cousin of Osman, refused to pledge allegiance until the murderers of Osman were punished. Ali, ever the legalist, argued that justice couldn't be served in chaos. Ali marched his army to confront Muawiyah's forces. A major civil war loomed. At the peak of the Battle of Siffin, Muawiyah's army hoisted Qur'ans on spears, calling for arbitration through God's book. Ali paused. He didn't want civil war between Muslims. He agreed to arbitration. That decision, that single moment of restraint, infuriated a faction of his own followers. They screamed, "La hukma illa lillah." Judgment belongs to God alone. Translation: you compromised with a heretic. You accepted man-made arbitration over divine judgment. You've betrayed Islam. And with that, the Kharijite movement was born. Kharijites, also known as Khawarij, the ideological forefathers of modern-day extremist groups such as ISIS, weren't just angry rebels. They were the world's first takfiris. Their doctrine was terrifying in its clarity. Any Muslim who commits a major sin is no longer a Muslim. They are kafir. A ruler who fails to govern strictly by the Quran is a kafir. Muslims who do not declare other sinners as kafir are themselves kafir. Rebellion, even against righteous leaders like Ali, is not just allowed, but mandatory. Killing Muslims, civilians, women, even children is fair game if they're judged as apostates or kafirs. In other words, you're either with us or you're dead. Sound familiar? This wasn't a disagreement over tax policy. This was the weaponization of theology to justify violence and terror against Muslims themselves. Their tactics included ambushing caravans, murdering civilians, beheading people for compromise, attacking pregnant women and children. The worst part? They believed they were purifying Islam, not destroying it. The first group in Islamic history to mix theology, excommunication, and political violence wasn't a sect. It was a self-declared vanguard of the pure, obsessed with takfir and terror. Many in the West believe Islam is fundamentally radical, that its doctrine, its scripture, its founding story are inherently violent, that the moment a Muslim picks up the Quran and actually reads it, he turns into a self-righteous, scimitar-wielding lunatic, screaming Allahu Akbar in a cave. They think extremism is not a deviation, but the natural and inevitable expression of Islam when it's taken seriously. Well, if that were true, then the Kharijites would have been running the show. But what actually happened? They were crushed, intellectually, spiritually, politically, and militarily. Not by Western liberalism, not by secularism, not by drone strikes or TED Talks, but by the Muslim community itself. Ali, who had tried to unify the Ummah through reason and compromise, had no choice. He led his army against them at the Battle of Nahrawan and dismantled their uprising with force. But it didn't stop there. The ulama, the scholars of Islam, got to work. They refuted the Kharijites with rigor, law, and a deep moral grammar. For centuries after, Kharijite theology was declared heretical by all four Sunni madhabs. The door on takfir slammed shut. You couldn't just declare someone a kafir because they sinned or disagreed with you. Legal theory developed guardrails, strict rules about rebellion, ethical constraints on force, and a serious emphasis on patience, consultation, and moral legitimacy. They elevated ijma', consensus, to act as a firewall against rogue zealots and theological lone wolves. This was Islam's immune system in action. And for over 1,000 years, it worked. The first group to weaponize purity, theology, and violence against fellow Muslims wasn't embraced. It wasn't institutionalized. It was condemned, fought, and buried by the Muslim world itself. From the very beginning, Muslims knew this was not Islam. This was its perversion, the hijacking of divine principles by men who mistook zeal for truth and self-righteousness for divine mandate. The Kharijites were the Westboro Baptists of early Islam. Loud, violent, fringe, and universally despised. And while their ideology was exiled to the margins, the memory of their fanaticism stayed alive, like a dormant virus. But it stayed dormant for a reason, because nothing in the mainstream Islamic tradition allowed it to flourish. Even the Hanbali school, often caricatured in the West as harsh or puritanical, was never radical. It was strict, yes.
It was literalist, absolutely.
but never violent. And it didn't emerge out of thin air either. Its founder, Ahmed ibn Hanbal, lived through a time when the Abbasid Caliphate, under the influence of rationalist Mutazilites, launched an inquisition, the Mihna, in which scholars were tortured and imprisoned for refusing to say that the Quran was created. Ahmed stood his ground, endured lashings, refused to bend, and became a symbol of intellectual independence and piety under state oppression. His theology was a defense mechanism. Hold fast to the text, trust revelation, resist speculative games. It wasn't about politics. It was about survival. His followers over the centuries inherited that ethos. They were skeptical of philosophy, allergic to innovation, cautious to the point of rigidity, but not revolutionaries. They weren't calling for caliphates, they weren't issuing takfir, and they certainly weren't blowing anything up. In fact, they were a minority within Sunni Islam, respected but marginal. Their conservatism insulated them from utopian fantasies. Their rigidity was legal, not militant. If anything, Hanbalism was a kind of intellectual no-fly zone, obsessed with preserving the boundaries of orthodoxy, not tearing the system down. So no, this wasn't radicalism. The real story of how fundamentalism became a force in the Muslim world doesn't begin in Baghdad or Damascus. It begins in London, Paris, and Washington. And the first man to be posthumously drafted into this geopolitical Frankenstein project, a Hanbali scholar born in the chaos of Mongol invasion. In the year 1258, the Muslim world was wrecked. The Mongols sacked Baghdad, burned its libraries, toppled the Abbasid Caliphate, and left behind a broken, leaderless civilization. Institutions crumbled. The political order that had held the Muslim world together for centuries vanished almost overnight. And in this civilizational vacuum, out of the rubble and ash, emerged a Hanbali scholar with a steel spine and a very, very short temper, Ibn Taymiyyah. Now let's be clear, he wasn't a terrorist, he wasn't a populist, and he wasn't running a rebel militia in the desert. He was a scholar, sharp, fearless, and fundamentally trying to make sense of a world where power had lost all moral legitimacy. The Mongols had converted to Islam, but were still running torture regimes and legal systems that had more to do with Genghis Khan than the Quran. So Ibn Taymiyyah asked the question no one else had the guts to ask. What do you do when a ruler calls himself Muslim, but governs like a pagan? His answer wasn't some anarchist manifesto. Did he argue that the Mongols weren't legitimate rulers? Yes. Did he call the world kafir? No. Did he advocate killing civilians, blowing up markets, or declaring random Muslims apostate? Absolutely not. Ibn Taymiyyah was fiercely anti-Mongol, anti-bid'ah, innovation, anti-philosophy. But he wasn't anti-sanity. He still operated within the framework of Islamic jurisprudence. His works were complex, internally consistent, and deeply rooted in the Quran and Sunnah. But here's the tragedy. Later jihadists and intellectuals cherry-picked him like a buffet. They ripped quotes out of context, ignored his legal boundaries, and treated his wartime fatwas as universal doctrine. What they didn't mention, Ibn Taymiyyah also wrote extensively on ethics, spirituality, and restraint. He condemned killing innocent people. He emphasized intention and divine justice. He was imprisoned repeatedly, not for violence, but for theological positions the state disliked. He was trying to hold the Islamic world together with ink and ijtihad. But fast forward to the 18th century, long after Ibn Taymiyyah had been buried, quoted, misquoted, and footnoted to death in dusty libraries. His ideas were yanked out of their historical context, stripped of their nuance, and turned into bullets. By the 18th century, the Muslim world was in decline. Not spiritually, not intellectually, but geopolitically. The great empires of Islam were still standing, but they were creaking at the joints. The Ottomans, once the terror of Europe, were now overstretched, bureaucratic, and slowly being outgunned by Western militaries. Mughal India had lost its spark. The arts flourished, but its political core was rotting. The Safavid Empire in Persia had collapsed, and its successors were locked in endless tribal feuds. The Muslim world wasn't dead, but it was drowsy, worn down by centuries of internal factionalism, court intrigue, and the creeping rise of European naval and commercial supremacy. Meanwhile, in the West, everything was changing. The scientific revolution had matured, the Enlightenment was blooming. European powers, especially Britain and France, were discovering something Islam had long ago mastered: the combination of global trade, statecraft, and ideological ambition. Only this time, the ideology wasn't divine. It was civilizational supremacy, cloaked in rationalism. So on one side of the world, you had Versailles, telescopes, and East India Company charters. On the other, you had viziers arguing over court etiquette, while European cannon fleets circled their coastlines. The balance of power was shifting, and fast. The Muslim world didn't know it yet, but it was becoming the next frontier, not just for trade or territory, but for cultural dismantling. And into this volatile mix, a Muslim world intellectually rich but politically fragmented, a Western world ascending but spiritually hollow, stepped a man from the desert with an idea so brutally simple, it could bypass all debate. Everyone is wrong except me. Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab was born in 1703 in Najd, a harsh tribal expanse where Islam hadn't evolved so much as it had calcified. This wasn't a center of Islamic thought, it was the margins. Far from the layered juristic traditions of Cairo, the Sufi lodges of Fez, or the cosmopolitan Islam of Istanbul, Najd was a place where simplicity wasn't a virtue, it was a necessity. And in that vacuum of intellectual sophistication, Abdul Wahhab saw one thing: corruption everywhere, bid'ah everywhere, shirk around every corner. His obsession became singular: purify Islam. But what did purify mean to a man raised in a place that had never fully absorbed Islam's intellectual or civilizational depth in the first place? His inspirations weren't the classical jurists or balanced reformers of Islamic history. He was influenced almost exclusively by Ibn Taymiyyah, a scholar writing during the Mongol apocalypse, whose harsh rulings were never meant for normal times. Taymiyyah himself was an exception in Islamic history, not the norm, a product of total collapse, not stability.
And Abdul Wahhab found in them a framework for a world that also felt politically unstable and spiritually compromised.
And even deeper than Taymiyyah, Abdul Wahhab's puritanical instincts oddly mirrored the Protestant reformers of Europe. Men like Calvin and Zwingli, who also smashed icons, banned saints, and tried to drag religion back to a mythic, uncorrupted beginning. What made him different was his laser focus on Tawheed, the absolute oneness of God, and his sharp rejection of anything he saw as violating it. Raised in an environment of weak political authority and diverse religious practices, he yearned for certainty, and his concept of absolute Tawheed provided just that. So he pushed for what he believed was a theological cleanup, stripping Islam of innovations, bid'ah, folk practices, saint veneration, and anything not explicitly rooted in the earliest generations. But here's the key: Abdul Wahhab was not trying to burn down the tradition. He saw himself as reviving it. He wasn't calling for mass violence or global revolution. He was offering a theology of purification, intense, extreme, uncompromising, and rooted in his reading and interpretation of scripture, but still grounded within the Islamic legal tradition of his Hanbali school. Then, history intervened. In 1744, Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab entered into a pact that would alter the course of modern Islamic politics. He allied with Muhammad ibn Saud, a tribal chief from Dir Iyah with ambition, a militia, and a taste for expansion. What followed wasn't a mere collaboration. It was the moment Wahhabism became a state, and more importantly, the moment a new version of political Islam was born.
The agreement was simple, but its consequences were seismic.
Ibn Abdul Wahhab would provide the religious legitimacy. Ibn Saud would provide the military muscle. Together, they would build a state. Not a caliphate, not a scholarly republic, but a theocratic war machine, forged in desert fire. The pact was explicit. Ibn Abdul Wahhab would give the Saud family divine justification for expanding their territory, branding any opposition as apostates, making rebellion against the state synonymous with rebellion against God. In return, the Saudis would enforce his theology with the sword.
no questions, no debate, no plurality. This was no longer Islam as moral compass to power. This was Islam as the source of power itself. Prior to this, Islamic governance had operated on a far more balanced plane. Scholars were independent, rulers were accountable, and legitimacy came from consensus, jurisprudence, and institutional structure. Whether under the Rashidun, the Abbasids, or even the Ottomans, there was always a dialectic tension between the ulama and the umara, between the custodians of knowledge and the wielders of power. But in Diriyah, those pillars were fused. The scholar now sat in the saddle of the warrior. Dissent wasn't criminal, it was kufr. Difference wasn't tolerated, it was deviation. And conquest wasn't political, it was religious obligation. The alliance effectively created a blueprint for the modern ideological state. Define a narrow orthodoxy, weaponize it through tribal power, and call it the return to true Islam. It marked a total departure from the classical Sunni tradition which, for over a millennium, had protected space for disagreement, built legal consensus across 4 madhabs, and prioritized patience, ethics, and balance. This wasn't that.
This was Islam 2.0, stripped of its institutional pluralism and recoded into a machine for central control. And horrifyingly, it worked. With Wahhabi theology as its divine engine and tribal power as its chassis, the Saudis expanded with ruthless speed. Cities fell. Shrines were demolished. Centuries of Islamic tradition in all its diversity, complexity, and nuance were branded as heresy and burned at the altar of purity. But here's the crucial nuance that history tends to skip. Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab never imagined this style of violence. In his own writings, jihad was tightly constrained, reserved for defense, not conquest. His theology was harsh, yes, but fenced in by scripture. It was absolutist, not expansionist. That changed the moment he was gone. The Saudis, now holding the reins, began retooling Wahhabism to serve a far older ambition: empire. They cherry-picked the fatwas of Ibn Taymiyyah, originally written in the chaos of the Mongol invasions, and rebranded them as timeless truths. The message was clear. If rulers deviate, declare jihad, not defensively, but offensively. The result? In 1802, Wahhabi forces stormed Karbala, slaughtered civilians, and desecrated sacred shrines. Not as a theological evolution, but as a strategic repurposing of doctrine to justify expansion. And here's the deeper irony. Neither Wahhab nor Ibn Saud realized what they had actually built. They thought they were reviving the faith. But what they created was a system so rigid, so streamlined, and so obedient to power that it became shockingly easy to hijack. It fused religious legitimacy with political control. It collapsed interpretation into enforcement. It erased centuries of jurisprudential process, the scholars, the councils, the debates, and replaced them with a singular, state-approved version of Islam, enforced by the sword, not the text. It didn't require nuance. It didn't tolerate dissent. It didn't adapt to culture, context, or history. All it needed was a pulpit, a militia, and the claim that this, and only this, was real Islam. Everything else? Bid'ah, kufr, target practice. And that's precisely why the model would prove so manipulable in the modern age. It was portable, binary, and power-serving. A self-contained ideological package that external actors, colonial, imperial, intelligence, could lift out of the desert and drop into any Muslim land. It didn't need scholars. It didn't need culture. It needed only a context of chaos and a willing sponsor. Which is exactly what came next: oil, Cold War, post-9/11 chaos.
The model wasn't copied because it was authentic. It was copied because it was useful. It spoke the language of purity, but obeyed the logic of power. And that's the real tragedy. What began as a local reform movement, born in theological urgency and historical trauma, was transformed into a global ideological export. Not because Islam demanded it, not because Muslims asked for it, but because power systems, Muslim and non-Muslim alike, engineered it that way. And perhaps the clearest reflection of just how engineered it felt is a document that surfaced nearly a century later. The Memoirs of Mr. Hemfer, British Spy to the Middle East, a forged but wildly influential text, claim that the British had personally cultivated Muhammad ibn Abd al-Wahhab to fracture the Muslim world from within. The story is apocryphal, yes, but its popularity wasn't. Translated across the Muslim world, whispered in mosques, cited in political speeches, it struck a nerve. Because whether or not it was true, it captured something deeper. The suspicion that Islam's internal ruptures weren't just historical accidents, but the outcome of intentional sabotage. The details were fake, the paranoia entirely real. By the time Hemfer's fiction went viral, the damage had already been done. The idea that radical Islam could be crafted, exported, and deployed, not by scholars, but by spies, had taken root. And that fear, justified or not, would shape how generations of Muslims viewed not just Wahhabism, but the West itself.
To understand how Europe ultimately stepped into the Muslim world, not just with cannons, but with creeds, you have to zoom out. The story of the West and Islam doesn't begin with colonial maps or oil contracts. It begins much earlier, in the shadow of the Crusades, the Reconquista, and the long twilight of Andalus. For centuries, Christendom viewed Islam not just as a rival faith, but as a civilizational rival. The Muslim world wasn't some backward corner of the earth. It was the beating heart of science, philosophy, literature, and law. While Europe was still recovering from the collapse of Rome, Muslims were building observatories in Baghdad, medical schools in Cairo, and translating Aristotle in Cordoba. The Crusades, despite all their bloodshed, failed to dismantle that intellectual dominance. But they seeded a deep and lasting resentment in European political memory. By the time the Ottomans took Constantinople in 1453, and their fleets began pushing into the Mediterranean, that memory turned into paranoia. Islam wasn't just different, it was winning. And Europe, battered by internal wars and theological schisms, responded the only way it knew how: through reinvention. So it reinvented itself. The Enlightenment, the scientific revolution, colonial exploration, these weren't just historical phases. They were part of Europe's civilizational comeback. But Islam was always in the backdrop, not as a partner, but as the other, the threat, the challenge to be answered. And then came the shift. By the 1700s, the power dynamic began to tilt. Europe industrialized, centralized, militarized. Muslim empires, long dominant, started to splinter. The Ottomans stagnated, the Mughals fractured, the Safavids collapsed. The Muslim world, for the first time in centuries, was politically vulnerable. That vulnerability wasn't lost on European eyes. And when they came, the French, the British, the Dutch, they didn't just bring ships and gunpowder. They brought something far more dangerous: the belief that Islam itself was the problem. By the dawn of the 19th century, the West no longer saw Islam as a powerful rival. It saw it as a broken system that needed managing, manipulating, or remaking. And right then, just over the dunes, in the tribal dust of Central Arabia, a new ideological prototype was already running. The British noticed, and they took notes. But before we jump into how they used those notes to tinker with Islamic theology like it was a colonial science experiment, we need to ask a deeper question. What was the empire even trying to do? Because this wasn't about theological preference.
The British weren't closet humbuddies. They didn't read Ibn Taymiyyah at Oxford and suddenly find themselves spiritually aligned. This was about control, resource control, narrative control, psychological control. And that brings us to the real rupture: colonialism. Not trade, not diplomacy, not the odd naval visit or port treaty, but colonialism in the fullest, bloodless sense of the word, the extraction and domination of foreign lands through a system of political, military, and epistemic control, designed to serve the colonizers' interests, not the colonized society's survival. Colonialism wasn't just about stealing land. It was about re-engineering worlds, breaking local knowledge systems, neutralizing power structures, and rewriting how entire populations saw God, history, and themselves. But colonialism didn't arrive in the Muslim world with fanfare or flags. It began quietly, with contracts, cargo, and cannonballs wrapped in accounting ledgers. In 1600, Queen Elizabeth I of England granted a royal charter to a group of ambitious merchants, forming what would become the British East India Company, a private firm with a license to trade, make treaties, and eventually wage war in the East. At the time, Britain wasn't an empire. It was an island with wool, some decent ships, and a habit of picking fights with richer neighbors. The real global players were elsewhere. The Ottomans ruled the crossroads of continents. The Mughals glittered over India, and the Ming still cast their shadow across East Asia. The British weren't on a civilizing mission. They were on a profit mission. And the East, with its spices, textiles, and gold-backed economies, was the jackpot. The East India Company began as one of many European outfits trying to crack into this market. It wasn't special. It rented warehouses, negotiated with Indian princes, and paid customs like everyone else. But unlike everyone else, the British had timing. While the Dutch dominated Indonesia and the Portuguese clung to Goa, the British found themselves in the right place at the wrong time, just as the Mughal Empire was slipping into crisis. By the mid-18th century, things accelerated. The Mughals were fragmented, local rulers were squabbling, and the company, armed with private armies and deep pockets, saw an opportunity. In 1757, at the Battle of Plassey, it struck. Through a mixture of military precision and political bribery, it overthrew the Nawab of Bengal and installed a puppet regime. It wasn't just a military win, it was a transformation. The British had discovered a new business model: colonization. They didn't just trade anymore. They taxed. They ruled. They absorbed entire provinces into a corporate-administered territory. India became less a partner and more a machine for imperial extraction. The East India Company, a for-profit business, was now governing over millions of subjects and redirecting rivers of wealth back to London. And all of this happened before the British Crown officially took control. But then came the shock that changed British psychology: the loss of America. The loss of America was more than just a geopolitical hiccup for Britain. It was a trauma, the kind that forces an empire to rethink what it is, what it fears, and what it must prevent at all costs. For centuries, Britain had seen colonies as assets, resources to extract, ports to secure, trade routes to protect. But America had offered something else: an idea. And ideas, the British realized, too late, could mutate into revolutions. The American colonies had grown tired of being milked for taxes without representation, forced into economic dependency, and dragged into Britain's endless European wars. By 1776, that frustration had matured into rebellion. They didn't just leave. They left with a constitution, a theology of freedom, and a conviction that imperial rule was illegitimate. That was the wake-up call. Ironically, Britain had only stumbled upon America because of the Muslim world. In the 15th century, European ships were desperately searching for a way around Ottoman-controlled trade routes. The Ottomans held the Silk Road. Muslim empires controlled the Red Sea, the Persian Gulf, and the Indian Ocean. Europe's hunger for Eastern goods and its inability to access them on its own terms drove its navigators westward, a detour that accidentally revealed an entire continent. Now, centuries later, Britain found itself forced to reroute again. With the Atlantic closed off politically, its imperial arteries turned eastward, toward Muslim lands. India, already under British commercial domination, became the focal point of imperial strategy. But India was only accessible through a landscape shaped by centuries of Islamic power, from the shores of the Gulf to the Ottoman ports of the Eastern Mediterranean. The geography of empire now ran through Islamic civilization. And it wasn't lost on British administrators that this wasn't just territory, it was a world with a memory, a long-standing political and intellectual order built on its own traditions of law, sovereignty, and moral legitimacy. Islam posed a unique challenge. Its institutions were decentralized, but deeply coherent. Its scholars dispersed, yet authoritative. Its law, both personal and political. The Islamic world didn't need to rediscover itself. It remembered. And what it remembered was dangerous to an empire that had just been humiliated by a group of Protestant farmers quoting scripture and demanding self-rule. So the British response evolved. Colonialism would no longer rely solely on economic coercion or military occupation. It would have to operate on the level of culture, theology, and epistemology. If Islam couldn't be erased, it would have to be reshaped into something legible to British power. Administrators began studying fiqh manuals and Quranic commentaries, not out of curiosity, but calculation. They wanted to understand what might inspire revolt and how to surgically remove it. India became the first testing ground. British officials reorganized Islamic courts, regulated madrasas, appointed loyal muftis, and censored fatwas. They criminalized certain Sufi rituals and elevated those interpretations of Islam that aligned with administrative docility. Theology wasn't banned, it was curated. In this new order, Islam would remain, but in a domesticated form. Ritual would be permitted as long as it didn't inspire resistance. Law could function as long as it deferred to imperial authority. The soul of the tradition would be left intact, but its political imagination would be amputated. Meanwhile, in the heart of Arabia, British observers began tracking something else entirely: the rise of a tribal theological alliance in Najd. The Wahhabi-Saudi partnership was gaining ground. Its message was stark, its theology rigid, and its attitude toward the Ottoman Caliphate openly hostile. To the British, this wasn't a threat. It was an opportunity. A theological movement that dismantled Ottoman legitimacy and centralized religious authority under a loyalist regime was strategically promising. It didn't need to be funded or invented. It just needed to be understood and eventually positioned. The empire was learning. From America, it had realized that belief systems could fracture global power. From Islam, it was learning how to manage belief itself. Control would now require more than soldiers. It would require scholars, maps, textbooks, the rewriting of norms. But Britain wasn't alone in this re-education project. Across Europe, the scramble to manage Islam had already begun, slowly, quietly, and with eerie synchronicity. The Age of Enlightenment had declared Europe rational, civilized, and divinely burdened with the task of fixing everyone else. And the Muslim world, rich, fractured, and still wearing the scent of a once world-dominating civilization, looked ripe for intervention. France was first to move with flair. In 1798, Napoleon invaded Egypt, not just with troops, but with 167 scholars, surveyors, linguists, and Orientalists. This wasn't a campaign. It was an expedition, part military conquest, part cultural experiment. The French didn't just want to occupy Egypt. They wanted to study it, catalog it, and repurpose it. Napoleon even issued a proclamation in Arabic, claiming he revered the Prophet and had come to liberate Muslims from Mamluk tyranny. But the message was clear. Colonialism was no longer just about land and taxes. It was about ideas, and Islam was now a philosophical opponent, not just a political one. Meanwhile, to the north, Russia was on a slow, brutal crawl through the Caucasus and Central Asia, swallowing Muslim khanates one after the other. Chechens, Circassians, Dagestanis, entire cultures were bombarded, annexed, and forcefully Russified. Tatar madrasas were shuttered, Sufi orders were suppressed. Islam in the Russian Empire became something to monitor, contain, and eventually re-engineer. Moscow didn't care much for theology, but it cared deeply about loyalty, and Islam's memory of autonomous governance made it dangerous. In Southeast Asia, the Dutch had already laid down commercial routes in Indonesia, but by the late 18th century, they were moving beyond trade. The world's largest Muslim population was slowly being folded into Dutch colonial governance. Javanese ulama were co-opted. Sufi networks were infiltrated. When revolts did happen, as they did in Padri and Java, the colonial response was surgical. Empower religious elites who preached quietism, exile the ones who didn't. Sound familiar?
What was happening in fragments across continents was a pattern, an emerging Western consensus on how to neutralize the political agency of Islam. The method varied by flag, but the logic was uncannily consistent. You didn't have to burn the Quran, just remove its relevance to governance. You didn't need to ban scholars, just put them on payroll. Let the rituals stay, let the mosques function, but hollow out the intellectual tradition. This was the quiet scramble before the scramble, before the Berlin Conference made it official, and the European powers sat down to slice Africa like a birthday cake. The Muslim world, vast and decentralized, was already being digested. Not all at once, and not always visibly, but bit by bit. The institutions that had once made it a force were being repurposed. And while each empire operated with its own dialect, they were all speaking the same language underneath. And no one mastered that conversion quite like the British. By the dawn of the 19th century, the Mughal Empire had all but collapsed, and the British weren't simply running ports and collecting taxes anymore. They were governing over 200 million people, including a massive, intellectually active, politically conscious Muslim population that still carried the memory of Mughal rule like a smoldering ember. Islam in India wasn't just theology, it was an infrastructure. It had its own courts, scholars, endowments, and historical legitimacy, and that made it dangerous. Not in some paranoid clash of civilizations sense, but in a very real logistical one. Muslims had networks, law, memory, and a vocabulary of power. So the empire responded the way it always does when confronted with deep-rooted systems. It didn't just destroy Islam. It tried to divide, classify, and reprogram it. First came surveillance. British officials, many of them Orientalists with more interest in control than culture, began systematically cataloging Muslim sects, customs, fatwas, lineages, and political leanings. Islam was broken down into types: legal Islam, mystical Islam, fanatical Islam, Sufi Islam, Sunni Islam, and, most importantly for their purposes, Wahhabi Islam. The label Wahhabi became the colonial dog whistle, vague enough to smear any dissenter, specific enough to justify arrest, execution, or exile. Whether you were a militant reformer or a conservative scholar arguing for Islamic governance through legal tradition, it didn't matter. If you posed a threat, you were Wahhabi. Then came the real earthquake, the 1857 rebellion. Call it the Indian Mutiny, the First War of Independence, or the Sepoy Revolt. Either way, it shattered the illusion of British invincibility. Sparked by a mix of military grievances, cultural disrespect, and religious provocation, the uprising saw Muslim and Hindu soldiers join forces and, crucially, declare loyalty to the last aging Mughal emperor Bahadur Shah Zafar, reactivating the idea of Muslim political legitimacy. The rebellion invoked jihad, khilafah, and Islamic symbolism, not just as spiritual ideas, but as political blueprints. And for the first time in nearly a century, the British saw how dangerous memory could be. When the dust settled, the repression was brutal. Villages were burned, civilians slaughtered. The Mughal emperor was exiled to Burma, but more revealing than the violence was who the British blamed. Despite the multi-religious nature of the uprising, it was Muslims who were cast as the prime instigators. The official line was clear: Islam, not just particular individuals, had armed the rebellion. Islam
had inspired the sepoys. Islam, with its mosques and madrasas and historical grievances, was now branded as the ideological enemy. And here, something profound happened. The British perception that political Islam was inherently seditious fused with imperial policy, and subsequently, the Western psyche. And with it came a new corrosive category, that any political expression of Islam was radicalism. Never mind that Islamic governance had historically coexisted with and protected vast non-Muslim populations across India, Persia, the Levant, Andalusia. Never mind that the Mughal Empire had enshrined pluralism, patronized Hindu temples, and minted coins in Sanskrit. To the British, those centuries were irrelevant. The 1857 revolt had made up their minds. And as labeling theory reminds us, the label becomes the reality. So began the systematic depoliticization of Islam in South Asia. Madrasas were shuttered or monitored. Scholars were imprisoned or exiled. The famed Madrasa Rahamiya, once the intellectual heart of Islamic political thought in Delhi, was dismantled. The Penal Code of 1860 criminalized speech or literature that invoked jihad, even in its classical, defensive sense. Islamic terminology became legal red flags, but the British didn't stop at suppression. They got strategic. They began investing in a compliant Muslim elite. Enter Sayyid Ahmed, or Sir Sayyid Ahmed Khan, as he liked to be called, who, after witnessing the rebellion, concluded that Muslim survival depended on loyalty, not resistance. He discouraged political agitation, promoted English education, and built the Aligarh movement around the idea of cultural adaptation over confrontation. It equated modernization with westernization and advocated modernism without sovereignty, faith without power. And this was the genius of British policy. They didn't crush Islam, they defanged it from within. They allowed mosques, as long as sermons stayed polite. They tolerated Sufi orders, as long as they avoided politics. They turned the imam into a spiritual therapist.
And slowly, a generation of Muslims came of age with a new reality, that Islam was now something internal, personal, abstract. That Sharia was not some universal law, but a personal code of conduct. It wasn't a system, it wasn't a civilization. It was a culture, safe, manageable, colonized. But it wasn't just Muslims who adapted. A generation in the West, too, colonial officers, scholars, policymakers, came of age believing something equally distorted. That Islamic political thought wasn't just dangerous, it was inherently radical. That if a Muslim spoke in the language of justice or sovereignty or law, it wasn't reform, it was rebellion. It wasn't political theology, it was proto-terrorism. And thus, Islamic activism, even when peaceful, was treated as sedition in religious dress. 2 generations, one Muslim, one Western, now shared the same distorted lens. One internalized it to survive, the other enforced it to rule. But while India's Islam was being muted, bureaucratically pacified, gradually absorbed into the spreadsheets of empire. But across the Mediterranean, something far less administrative was underway. In 1798, as we touched on earlier, Napoleon landed in Egypt with Orientalists, cannons, cavalry, and a Quran-flavored sales pitch. His Arabic proclamation flattered the prophet, invoked Islamic terms, and presented the French as allies of the faith. It was a colonial sugarcoating strategy that would echo for centuries. The progressive West coming to save oppressed Muslims from tyrants. But beneath the performance was a discovery that stayed with France long after Napoleon's campaign collapsed. The Muslim world wasn't just terrain to be occupied. It was a civilizational structure. France didn't forget that encounter. The failure in Egypt didn't diminish the appetite. It refined the approach. French thinkers, soldiers, and administrators came away with a new understanding. To dominate such a world required more than military victories. Egypt offered a glimpse into a rival worldview,
and convinced France, much like it would Britain, that dismantling it would require a slower, more invasive form of power. But unlike Britain, which sought to dismantle and reshape the Islamic soul from within, France sought to completely eradicate it. 1830, France lands in Algeria under the noble banner of a bakery bill. No joke. A diplomatic insult involving some debt over wheat was all the excuse Paris needed to launch a full-blown military invasion. On paper, it was retaliation for a diplomatic insult, the infamous fly whisk incident, where the Dey of Algiers allegedly swatted a French consul with a horsehair fan. In reality, it was a convenient pretext. France, reeling from the loss of Haiti and desperate to distract from domestic unrest, was on the hunt for imperial redemption. Algeria, rich, fragmented, nominally Ottoman, and geographically strategic, fit the bill perfectly. But this wasn't a surgical strike. This was total conquest. Within a few years, France wasn't just in Algeria. It was under Algeria's skin. The invasion turned into a settler colonial project of staggering violence. Villages were burned. Entire tribes were displaced. Between famine, mass executions, and forced labor, over 1/3 of Algeria's population perished in the first few decades. This wasn't civilization. This was civilizational decapitation. The violent uprooting of an Islamic society from its institutions to its imagination. Mosques were turned into barracks. Akaf, religious endowments that had sustained scholars, were seized and nationalized. Arabic, the language of law and revelation, was purged from education and replaced with French. Sharia courts were shut down. To be Muslim in colonial Algeria was to live under surveillance, legally, spiritually, and existentially. Now yes, this may sound familiar if you've been paying attention to what I said earlier about British India, but make no mistake, this was a different beast. The British co-opted Islam with bureaucracy and carrots. The French tried to obliterate it with bayonets and blackboards. And this wasn't some civilizational vacuum they were walking into. Pre-colonial Algeria had been part of the Ottoman Empire for centuries. Not a backwater, but a functioning society with courts, Sufi orders, scholarly circles, and a well-rooted Islamic legal tradition. It wasn't perfect, no polity is, but it was coherent. It had spiritual structure, cultural autonomy, and political memory. Where the British sought to manage Islam, the French sought to erase it. And in both models, Islam wasn't engaged on its own terms, as a civilization with its own internal mechanisms for reform and renewal. It was treated as an obstacle, a problem, a relic. And out of this suffocation came one of the most remarkable figures of the 19th century, Emir Abdelkader, a Sufi sheikh, a scholar, a warrior, and arguably the last Islamic statesman of the pre-colonial world who still embodied the classical balance: spirituality with politics, sword with restraint, theology with ethics. From 1832 to 1847, he resisted French occupation with something almost extinct today: a moral code. He refused to kill civilians. He treated prisoners with dignity. And years later, when he settled in Damascus, he protected thousands of Christians from a massacre, because to him, that's what Islam demanded. But Abdelkader was one man. France was a rising industrial empire with no time for nuance. By the end of the 19th century, over 1 million Algerians had died. The entire institutional infrastructure of Islam, its scholars, courts, and curricula, had been bulldozed into the sand. Then came 1871, the Kabyle Revolt, a massive uprising led by tribal leaders like Sheikh Mukrani, sent shockwaves through the colonial psyche. This wasn't supposed to happen. The mission civilisatrice was supposed to tame the natives, not provoke unified rebellion. A decade later, France imposed the Code de l'Indigène, a legal apartheid regime that declared Muslims second-class citizens in their own land. And here's the kicker. To gain full French citizenship, you had to renounce Islam. Let that sink in. In the land of Abdelkader, Islam itself became legally incompatible with citizenship. The colonial project didn't just undermine Islamic authority, it hollowed it out. It dismantled the immune system. The centuries-old mechanisms of legal consensus, Sufi ethics, and institutional debate that had kept extremism fringe. And in that vacuum, as history always warns, anything can grow. The West didn't invent radical Islam in Algeria, but it made sure the structures that kept it in check were smashed beyond repair. The problem wasn't Islam. It was the decapitation of Islam's internal checks by a power that didn't understand it, didn't care to, and certainly didn't want it resilient. And yes, as always, the world was watching. Muslims across the globe read reports of Algeria. Some saw a mirror, others saw a warning, but all saw the same political equation crystallizing. Resistance plus religion equals extremism, at least through the Western gaze. It was another chapter in the quiet rewriting of geopolitical code. That Islamic political consciousness, the kind that had governed empires, built cities, protected minorities, and persisted for centuries, without imploding into fanaticism, was now being reframed as a threat in waiting. And that idea would come in handy later, especially when the time came to divide, disrupt, or redirect entire regions under the banner of security and reform. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, because while Algeria burned, the oil hadn't started flowing yet, and the British, ever pragmatic, ever calculating, had their eyes on a different sandbox, one with tribes, theology, trade routes, and soon, black gold. As discussed earlier, the loss of the American colonies in 1776 had jolted the British imperial psyche. Britain had gambled on dominance across the Atlantic and lost spectacularly. The result was a shift in imperial gravity. With the West no longer secure, the East became existential. India wasn't just important because it was big. It was important because it was everything the empire wanted to be. Self-financing, strategically located, and symbolically indispensable. After the loss of America, Britain needed more than a replacement colony. It needed an imperial anchor, one that could not only deliver revenue, but stabilize Britain's position in an increasingly multipolar world. India, with its vast population, deep commercial networks, and rich agricultural and industrial base, became that anchor. Geopolitically, India was also perfectly positioned. It sat at the crossroads of East-West trade, bordered the Islamic heartlands, and gave the British a springboard into Central Asia and the Far East. And perhaps most crucially, it bordered Russia, Britain's primary rival in the 19th century Great Game. In this chessboard of empire, India wasn't a pawn, it was the king. Protecting it wasn't just about maintaining a colony. It was about preserving the empire's credibility. That meant building walls around India, not literal ones, but geopolitical buffers, strategic insulation. Every route into India, by sea or by sermon, through politics or pilgrimage, had to be watched, contained, or co-opted. And nowhere was this logic more vital than along the empire's maritime flank, the Persian Gulf. If India was its heart, the Gulf was the empire's windpipe, and whoever controlled it could choke the empire at will. The Ottoman Empire still had nominal claims over parts of Arabia. Persian influence loomed to the north, and growing Russian presence in Central Asia haunted British nightmares. This wasn't paranoia, it was geopolitics. But unlike India, where direct rule had become the model after the crown took control, the Gulf presented a different opportunity. Here, the British opted for a cheaper, cleaner strategy: dominance through treaties, control without colonization, sovereignty without soldiers. The innovation was imperial subcontracting. London didn't need to own the Gulf. It just needed to lock it down. The pretext was piracy. But like most imperial categories, piracy was a flexible term. It was a frame, a rhetorical device, weaponized in imperial dispatches. Declassified British records, including from the India Office files and Persian Gulf residency reports, reveal the extent of this semantic sleight of hand. Nearly every form of naval resistance by Arab tribes in the Gulf, especially those exhibiting even faint theological zeal, was branded piratical and Wahhabi-inspired. It didn't matter if the conflict was tribal, territorial, or transactional. If it disrupted British shipping or bypassed British control, it was piracy. If it spoke in Islamic idiom, it was fanaticism. If it did both, it was a threat to empire. Pirate, fanatic, Wahhabi. These terms weren't descriptive. They were strategic. They allowed London to delegitimize indigenous resistance, justify naval aggression, and project itself as the civilized arbiter of a chaotic Islamic coast. It was the language of empire, cloaked in law. And the Wahhabis, of course, had already made their entrance. As we mentioned earlier, in 1802, the Saudi-Wahhabi alliance, a fusion of theological rigidity and dynastic ambition, stormed Karbala, desecrated the shrine of Imam Hussein, and massacred thousands. It was a direct assault on Shia Islam, yes, but more profoundly, it was an existential embarrassment to the Ottoman Empire, whose legitimacy rested in part on its claim to protect the holy cities. The blowback came quickly. In 1811, the Ottomans tasked Muhammad Ali of Egypt, their most capable proxy, to crush the Saudi state. His son, Ibrahim Pasha, led a long and grinding campaign into Central Arabia.
By 1818, the Wahhabi capital of Diriyah was obliterated. Its leader, Abdullah ibn Saud, was shipped to Constantinople, where he was executed, and his decapitated head was displayed as a warning. You couldn't play caliph without permission.
The first Saudi state had collapsed. But look closely. The cannons were Ottoman. The benefits were British. Because Wahhabi expansionism had become a liability. The theological absolutism of this first Saudi state had unnerved Britain's tribal allies in the Gulf. Its raids had disrupted maritime trade, and its hostility to both the Ottomans and Shia populations had turned Arabia into a volatile theater. So when Diriyah fell, Britain didn't mourn, it exhaled. In fact, internal correspondence between British Gulf agents and the Bombay Marine show a calculated detachment, almost relief, at Wahhabism's military defeat. They didn't need to dirty their hands. The Ottomans had done the dirty work for them. An empire, after all, is about outcomes, not authorship. While Wahhabism was politically dismembered, Britain decided it was time to settle scores on the coast. In 1819, it launched a full-scale naval offensive on Ras Al Khaimah, the stronghold of the formidable Al-Qawasin, seafarers who refused British dictate and controlled vital shipping lanes. Villages were shelled, ships were torched, ports were seized. London wanted more than punishment. It wanted a message sent, and the message came in the form of ink and parchment. In 1820, Britain imposed the General Maritime Treaty, a document that, on paper, outlawed piracy. In practice, it redrew the very concept of sovereignty. Signatory tribes were now bound to British arbitration in external affairs, forbidden from aligning with rival empires, the Ottomans or Persians, and stripped of autonomous naval activity. Their waters were British waters. Their alliances were subject to London's approval. This wasn't colonization in the classic sense. It was legal encirclement, empire by treaty. The system that followed, later known as the trucial system, gave rise to the modern UAE, Bahrain, and parts of Oman. Local rulers kept their thrones and flags but lost their leverage. Defense, British. Foreign policy, British. Naval trade, British. What emerged was a chain of princely protectorates, tribal in dress, imperial in function. From 1818 to 1824, Wahhabism lay dormant, politically decapitated but doctrinally intact. And then in 1824, Turki ibn Abdullah, a survivor of the Diriyah collapse, quietly recaptured Riyadh. With little fanfare and even less resistance, he declared the resurrection of the emirate. The second Saudi state was born. It was smaller, more cautious in its ambitions, but no less resolute in its worldview. The shrines weren't restored. The Sufi orders remained banned. The binary remained: monotheist versus heretic, loyalty versus betrayal, Wahhabi versus everyone else. Military expansion was shelved, but theological exclusivism calcified. And while the Saudis were regrouping inland, the British were redrawing the coasts. Over the 19th century, they replicated the Ras Al Khaimah formula across the Gulf, under the guise of protection. But protection from whom? From the Ottomans? From the Persians? And increasingly, from the ideological friction caused by Wahhabi revivalism. Yet here's the imperial paradox. The very theology Britain once feared was becoming the one it could tolerate. Even leverage, especially after 1857, when the world's largest Muslim population turned its swords toward British rule. The Indian rebellion had rocked the imperial psyche. The symbols were Islamic. The rebels carried fatwas as much as muskets. It terrified British administrators. So in the aftermath, they began to surveil Islam, not just as a religion, but as a political technology. Any theology that could galvanize masses was now suspect. Any doctrine that encouraged critical scholarship, moral autonomy, or pluralistic reasoning was a threat. Wahhabism, by contrast, began to look quite useful. It didn't encourage revolt. It wasn't mystical. It distrusted the Ottomans. It upheld state authority. It demanded uniformity. And perhaps most importantly, it was tribal enough to remain localized, easy to isolate, easy to co-opt. British documents from the India Office and Foreign Office archives show this changing tone. Wahhabism shifted in imperial description, from fanatic threat to purifying force. Not because its ideas had changed, but because its strategic position had.
While the British crushed or contained Islamic movements that drew from Sufi ethics, pan-Islamic solidarity, or scholarly autonomy, they quietly left Wahhabism alone. They didn't fund it, they didn't formally endorse it, but they also didn't obstruct it. They let it survive. And in empire, that's often enough. They had treaties blanketing the coastline: Bahrain, 1861, Kuwait, 1899, Qatar, 1916. They had installed tribal rulers who owed their survival not to religious authority, but to British protection. And these rulers were often far more ideologically comfortable with Wahhabi doctrines than with the pluralist traditions of classical Islamic law. Why? Because Wahhabism centralized legitimacy. It discouraged dissent. It reduced religion to rules that the elites could enforce.
But not everyone was comfortable. As the British fortified their Gulf architecture with tribal compliance and theological rigidity, a different kind of resistance was brewing. Not in the mountains, but in the margins of thought. Because while Wahhabism was being tolerated for its convenience and Sufi traditions were being muzzled for their complexity, a third voice was rising, one that didn't reject modernity, but refused to inherit it secondhand. It came not from Arabia, but from the itinerant mind of a man who belonged to many places and none. A philosopher, a firebrand, a modern Muslim, before that phrase meant anything.
While colonial administrators were redrawing borders and brokered clerics were scripting new fatwas, a different struggle was unfolding. Not on the battlefield, but in the bloodstream of the Muslim world, a war for political consciousness. And no one diagnosed that war more clearly than Syed Jamal al-Din al-Afghani. He was born in 1838, somewhere near Kabul. His birthplace is disputed,
Iran claims him as one of their own. Afghans, fiercely protective of their national identity, insist otherwise. But in truth, Jamal al-Din al-Afghani belonged to no one and everyone at once. His identity, much like his mission, transcended borders. Afghani began like many Muslim intellectuals, and his peers of the time, in the traditional system, a madrasa education in theology, logic, law, Arabic grammar, and philosophy. But unlike many of his peers, he studied Avicenna's metaphysics, Aristotle's logic, Al-Farabi's political philosophy, and then dove into Descartes, Bacon, and the Enlightenment. He didn't see conflict. He saw continuity. Where others built walls between the Islamic and the modern, he was drawing bridges. And he was doing this at a time when most scholars either feared Western thought or fetishized it. Afghani did neither. He engaged it. As he later declared, those who imagine that they are saving religion by imposing a ban on some sciences and knowledge are enemies of religion. In the apparent friction between traditional Islamic discourse and post-Enlightenment European ideas of modernity, Afghani saw a synthesis waiting to happen, a project that Islamic civilization itself had once led, but had since abandoned. In his 20s, he traveled to India, just as the British were consolidating their grip after the 1857 rebellion. It was a turning point. He witnessed how theology was no longer treated as thought, but as threat. How colonial authorities labeled fatwas as subversion. How the Muslim elite either collaborated or collapsed. He saw how the British equated every Islamic impulse with treason. This wasn't just political occupation, it was an epistemic one. The first thing the colonizer conquers, he later wrote, is the mind. From India, he returned to his roots, Afghanistan. Not out of nostalgia, but out of strategy. He believed that if revival was going to happen, it had to begin not just in lecture halls, but in the courts of power. At the time, Amir Dost Muhammad Khan ruled a fragile kingdom, balancing British pressures from the south and Russian encroachment from the north. Afghani became his advisor. This is where we get to see Afghani not just as a philosopher, but as a political operator. He wanted reform. He wanted modernization. But on Islamic terms. He wasn't pushing westernization. He was pushing internal revival. Better education, stronger institutions, a more engaged and independent ulema. But he was swimming against the tide. Dost Muhammad, and later his son Sher Ali, saw Afghani as too bold, too independent, too dangerous. He wasn't just talking about education reform. He was critiquing the entire elite structure. He challenged the passive clerics. He criticized the palace's reliance on foreign loans. He warned that without awakening the people, Afghanistan would become just another chess piece on the imperial board. Eventually, he was forced out. His politics had become inconvenient. After his disillusioning stint in Afghanistan, where he saw firsthand how Muslim rulers, even when nominally sovereign, often lacked any project beyond survival, Afghani moved westward again. And this time, his eyes turned toward the Ottoman Empire, the last major Muslim power still standing, or at least still pretending to. By the mid-19th century, the Ottomans were a ghost of their former selves, but they weren't blind to it. They had seen the writing on the wall. The empire had suffered repeated military defeats against Russia, Austria, and the British. The once feared Janissaries, elite infantry born from centuries of Islamic military tradition, had become so corrupt and obsolete that they had to be violently disbanded in 1826. Their muskets were no match for British rifles, and their discipline had long eroded. Even the Ottomans' own generals, who had seen the European armies up close, not just the firepower, but the discipline, the technology, the speed of command, knew if they didn't modernize, they would not survive. Europe had surged ahead, not just in weapons, but in institutions, education, and bureaucracy. And the Ottomans intended to follow suit, so they launched a series of desperate reforms, beginning with the Tanzimat reforms, 1839 to 1876. This was the Ottoman answer to the Enlightenment. Centralize the state, modernize the military, secularize the legal system, expand education. New schools were opened to teach engineering and science. Uniforms were westernized. Railways were built. Bureaucrats were trained in European languages. There was even a push for Ottomanism, a new civic identity, inspired by the notion of nationalism, that tried to paper over the cracks between Turks, Arabs, Kurds, and others under a single imperial banner. But to Afghani,
who visited Istanbul during this phase, the reforms felt shallow, contradictory, and ultimately tragic. This wasn't a confident civilization reforming itself. This was a rattled empire, borrowing the institutions of the very powers that were slowly carving it up. On paper, yes, there was modernization. But underneath, Afghani saw a loss of intellectual confidence. The Ottomans were mimicking Europe's institutions without reviving Islam's own intellectual legacy. They were importing the grammar of Western modernity, but without the moral compass of their own tradition.
They were modernizing structures, railroads, armies, ministries, but leaving the Muslim soul untouched, or worse, alienated. Afghani had no problem with modernization, but what he couldn't stand was the way modernity was being reduced to mimicry, imitation without interrogation. He saw Ottoman reformers quoting Rousseau, translating Montesquieu, but refusing to revisit Al-Farabi, Ibn Khaldun, or Al-Mawardi. They weren't reviving the spirit of ijtihad. They were replacing it with borrowed slogans, born out of a distinctly different civilization's intellectual evolution. Worse still, the reforms often produced confusion rather than clarity. Secular codes were introduced alongside Sharia courts, leading to legal contradictions. Western-style parliaments were floated, then suspended. New schools were opened, but filled with administrators who still thought in medieval terms. The Ottoman state became split between two minds, one facing Paris, the other still orbiting around a crumbling past. The Ottomans had once been the spearhead of Islamic power. Now they were legislating like the French, governing like the British, and teaching philosophy as if Descartes had invented thinking. To Afghani, this was a recipe for disaster. Because when you hollow out a religious tradition without renewing it from within, you don't get secular democracy, you get identity crisis. An identity crisis in a colonized world doesn't stay quiet forever. It either collapses inward or lashes out violently. And Afghani saw both already beginning. The Muslim world, he warned, is not declining because of faith, but because of fear. Fear of Europe, fear of freedom, fear of its past, fear of its own potential. He knew where this would lead. If Muslims kept imitating Europe without reviving their own foundations, eventually a backlash would come. People would grow resentful, lost, angry. And when that happened, when the vacuum cracked open, it wouldn't be filled by philosophers. It would be filled by fanatics. The ulema, once the guardians of moral and intellectual life, had become docile, and the sultans, increasingly paranoid, saw any independent thought, especially Afghani's, as potential sedition. So, once again, Afghani became a problem. His ideas were too sharp. He was placed under surveillance. His lectures were restricted. And eventually, he was pushed out. Istanbul had no space for someone who refused to flatter power or sugarcoat decline. So, Afghani moved on, this time south, to Cairo. But Cairo in the 1870s wasn't just another stop. It was the perfect storm. Decades earlier in 1818, Ibrahim Pasha, the son of Egypt's modernizing strongman, Muhammad Ali, had marched deep into Arabia and crushed the first Saudi Wahhabi state. Egypt had done what the Ottomans couldn't, impose order on the Arabian interior and briefly reassert the caliphate's authority. But that Egypt, sharp, centralized, semi-autonomous, was already on a different trajectory. Under Muhammad Ali and his successors, Egypt was chasing Europe. Steamships, conscription, industrial schools, cotton exports. And under Khedive Ismail, or Ismail the Magnificent as newspapers called him, that chase turned manic. Palaces, opera houses, railways, and most of all, the Suez Canal, a waterway that would redefine global trade and, in time, become Britain's imperial lifeline to India. But the progress came on credit, and the creditors came from London and Paris. By the late 1860s, Egypt's foreign debt had spiraled out of control. Interest payments alone swallowed half the state's revenue. And in 1876, the mask came off. The British and the French demanded direct oversight. The Caisse de la Dette Publique, a foreign-controlled financial council, took charge of Egypt's economy. Ministries were infiltrated.
Revenue streams were redirected. British and French officials didn't just monitor policy, they dictated it. Egypt, once the hammer of the Ottomans, was now being managed like a failing estate. Its rulers still wore Ottoman robes, but real power sat in European hands. And the people, peasants, students, scholars, were watching it happen, silently, powerlessly. This was the Cairo Afghani entered, a place suspended between reform and occupation, trapped in the language of modernization, but gutted of sovereignty. In Cairo, Afghani didn't start a riot. He started a fire. And it wasn't with swords or slogans. It was with ideas. At a time when the ulama were quoting from dusty commentaries, and native elites were mimicking Europe's cosmetics without touching its core ideas, Afghani sat with students in smoky tea houses, private salons, and most importantly, Al-Azhar, the intellectual heart of the Sunni Muslim world. And from here, he ignited something that Egypt hadn't seen in generations. His lectures were electric, not just because of what he said, but how he said it. He didn't quote Quranic verses in isolation. He weaponized them. He didn't speak in abstract moral platitudes. He spoke like a man who had seen empire come through the canal.
He fused Islamic ethical language with political urgency.
And slowly, the students began to gather, not just from Al-Azhar, but from across Cairo. One of them was Muhammad Abdu, who would later become Egypt's Grand Mufti. Afghani's central argument was simple in form, but explosive in consequence. Islam is not a theology of submission. It is a mandate for liberation. Liberation from what? From colonial rule, from clerical gatekeeping, from fossilized tradition, from fear itself. He didn't romanticize the past. He resurrected its spirit. The Prophet, peace be upon him, he reminded them, didn't just come with prayer beads and sermons. He came with revolution. He dismantled tribal privilege, abolished blood vengeance, empowered slaves and orphans, and defied Meccan oligarchs. That wasn't obedience. That was defiance, moral courage, anchored in revelation and expressed through political action. And that interpretation, it sent shockwaves through Cairo, because under British supervision and Khedive rule, Islam had been steadily bureaucratized, reduced to personal piety and moral quietism. In the colonial political script, the job of religion was to soothe, to stabilize, to keep the poor hoping for justice in the afterlife, and keep the educated elite obedient in this one. Afghani tore that to shreds. He said Islam wasn't about waiting for paradise. It was about building dignity here. Islam wasn't a crutch for empire. It was a weapon against it. Islam wasn't the monopoly of clerics or caliphs. It belonged to those who could think. And that was his most dangerous challenge, ijtihad. Afghani taught that Muslims had not abandoned the Quran in practice, but in thought. The Quran called them to reflect. The Prophet commanded them to seek knowledge. The classical jurists had reasoned, debated, and built one of the most sophisticated legal traditions in human history. But by the 19th century, that intellectual vitality had collapsed into rote memorization and sterile obedience. And the colonial project loved it that way. Afghani threw open the door. He told his students, you can question, you must reason, you have the right, no, the duty to think for yourself. He told Egyptians that Khedive Ismail's modernization, the trains, the opera houses, the printing presses, were all mirages. What good is a railway if your mind moves in chains? What good is a press if it only prints what your master approves?
True reform, he argued, would not come from copying the West, but from reviving the Islamic tradition of reason and welding it to the tools of modern power. This wasn't pan-Islamism as some nostalgic fantasy. This was intellectual insurrection, and it spooked everyone. To the British, still haunted by the memory of 1857, He was a subversive, a man using Quranic verses to spark political unrest. They didn't always understand Afghani, but they understood enough to know he was trouble. He didn't preach jihad in the classical military sense. He preached a kind of intellectual jihad. And the one thing the British had learned post-1857 was, ideas precede uprisings. To the palace, he was a threat, a man who could rouse students to question the entire system. Khedive Ismail, for all his talk of reform, ruled with a deep insecurity. His palace was ringed with European advisors and financial handlers, and his legitimacy came as much from foreign approval as from domestic strength. Afghani was making him nervous. A state that borrows its architecture, its language, and its laws, Afghani once told his students, is not a state, it's a well-decorated dependency. And so the walls began to close. The British consul sent discreet warnings. The palace advisors whispered that Afghani was sowing unrest. The clerics called him dangerous, unorthodox, arrogant, foreign. And the students? They were getting bolder. Some had started speaking out. Others were quoting Afghani in their own sermons and pamphlets. A current was forming. And as had become a recurrence in his life, Afghani was expelled from Cairo too. One night, in 1879, they simply put him on a boat and sent him away.
Expelled from Cairo, Afghani drifted from capital to capital, Istanbul, Tehran, Paris, stirring minds, attracting suspicion, never staying still. He died in 1897, under watch in the Ottoman capital, alone and subdued. But while his body was buried quietly, his ideas were not. They lingered, smoldering under the surface, waiting for someone who could not just carry the flame, but refine it, focus it, and give it institutional legs. That someone was Muhammad Abduh. Born in 1849 in the Nile Delta town of Tanta, Abduh emerged from the ranks of Egypt's religious elite, graduating through Al-Azhar, the great bastion of Sunni orthodoxy. But he was no ordinary scholar. While others remained buried in medieval commentaries, Abduh wrestled with the crises of his time. He was a product of classical Islamic learning, yes, but also deeply attuned to the shifting tectonics of the modern world: colonial occupation, the crisis of Muslim political decline, the rise of European science, and the moral vacuum of autocracy. He wasn't just a jurist, he was a thinker, a synthesizer, a man who could quote Ghazali and Mill in the same breath, and who saw no contradiction in doing so. When Afghani arrived in Cairo, Abduh became his closest student. But more than that, he became his inheritor. Where Afghani was fire and rebellion, Abduh was design and precision. He took the raw political philosophy Afghani had ignited and gave it form, crafting a reform project that could speak within institutions, not just against them. By 1899, Abduh had risen to the position of Grand Mufti of Egypt, the highest religious office in the land. But if the British and the palace expected him to settle into ceremonial comfort, they miscalculated. Abduh didn't accept that authority was an excuse for inertia. He used his position not to rubber stamp the status quo, but to question its foundations. His central thesis was both ancient and revolutionary, that ijtihad, the tradition of independent, reasoned interpretation, was not a relic of the past, but the very lifeblood of a dynamic Islam. What had strangled Muslim societies, he argued, wasn't the faith itself, but the clerical bureaucracy that had reduced divine law to a fossil, frozen, rigid, and terrified of change. Abduh wanted to unfreeze it. He called for a return not just to the Quran, but to the Quran as a living, thinking, moral engine. He challenged the culture of taqlid, blind imitation, that had come to dominate Islamic scholarship. He argued that rituals should serve spirit, not suppress it, that worship without consciousness was no worship at all, that ethical deliberation, not rote repetition, was the mark of a believing mind. This wasn't just theological critique, it was civilizational diagnosis. He championed women's education, not as a Western import, but as a Quranic imperative. He issued fatwas that bypassed ossified clerical gatekeeping.
He advocated a socially grounded Islam, one that adapted without surrendering, modernized without mimicking. The aim was clear: to produce a Muslim intellectual class that could resist both imperial domination and internal decay. The British watched with a mix of confusion and quiet dread. To the colonial mind, Abduh sounded moderate. His language was rational, his references were classical, he wore the garb of orthodoxy. But the implications of his thought ran dangerously deep, because if Muslims could think for themselves, not through foreign textbooks or missionary schools, but through the revival of their own tradition, the colonial project was in trouble.
British India Office and Foreign Office correspondence from this period reflects exactly that anxiety. They debated whether men like Abdu were counterweights to fanatics or intellectual subversives. The lines were blurry. What wasn't blurry was the threat. Abdu's reform didn't seek foreign models. It awakened internal ones. And that terrified both the colonial administrator and the palace court. Because it reawakened a political Islam, not in the sense of theocracy, but of moral autonomy. It taught that Muslims didn't need to be ruled. They could rule themselves. That Islam wasn't a relic to be preserved in glass cases, but a set of principles for building modern justice. It was too late to shut the door. The students had heard, and one of those students would take Abdu's message even further. His name was Muhammad Rashid Rida.
Born in 1865 in the Ottoman province of Tripoli, present-day Lebanon, Rida came of age in a world where Islamic sovereignty was more performance than power. The caliphate still existed, but its spine had been broken. Ottoman decline wasn't a coming event. It had become a European ritual, managed in foreign capitals through debt commissions, protectorate deals, and gunboat diplomacy. Colonialism wasn't arriving, it was already there, from Algiers to Delhi, from Khartoum to Jakarta. Muslim rulers signed treaties they didn't understand, reformed institutions they didn't control, and prayed beneath chandeliers imported from Vienna, while their treasuries bled interest payments to London and Paris. In the cracks between these broken sovereignties, a civilizational anxiety was taking hold, and across the Muslim world, thinkers, clerics, students, and statesmen were asking the same question, one that would haunt the next century. What went wrong? For Rida, the answer wasn't just military defeat or technological lag. The rifles of the British and the railroads of the French were symptoms. The deeper illness, he believed, was epistemic, a spiritual and intellectual surrender. The Muslim, he would later write, has become a stranger to the Quran, not in tongue, but in truth. Islam, in his view, had not failed. It had been abandoned, hollowed out from within. The Quran, once the engine of transformation, had become a ceremonial chant. Sharia, once a flexible framework rooted in ethical deliberation, had hardened into dogma. And the Muslim intellect, once bold, curious, and expansive, had been smothered by centuries of taqlid, blind conformity dressed as tradition. But Rida didn't position himself as a revolutionary outsider. He saw himself as a mujaddid, a reviver in the prophetic mold, calling his community back not to nostalgia, but to its lost institutional vitality and moral clarity. Like his teacher Muhammad Abdu, and through him Afghani, Rida believed that Islam could once again form the basis of a just, intelligent, and resilient civilization. But unlike them, he came of age as the empire was not just declining, it was unraveling. The century was turning, and the world with it. He understood that the age of pulpits was now also the age of print. The stakes were existential. In 1898, just 1 year after Abdu helped bring him to Cairo, Rida founded Al-Manar, a journal that would become the most influential Islamic platform of its time. But it was more than a magazine. It was a political current, a transcontinental conversation, a manifesto of revival. Its pages reached clerics in Syria, bureaucrats in Istanbul, rebels in Sudan, reformists in India, and students in Java. All read it, all debated it, all responded to it. Rida's message was as clear as it was dangerous.
Islam was not incompatible with science, reason, or modern governance. But that reconciliation would not happen on Europe's terms. We will not borrow their beliefs to modernize our own, he wrote. We will modernize through our own principles. Those principles, ijtihad, shura, consultation, maslaha, public interest, were not new. They were native to the Islamic tradition. But under colonial rule and clerical stagnation, they had become buried beneath layers of bureaucracy and fear. He often emphasized an argument that would later become the bedrock of political Islam. Islam is a deen, not just a religion in the Western sense, but a complete moral and civilizational system meant to shape law, education, politics, and economy. A world where Islam was reduced to ritual and stripped of political agency, he warned, would always remain vulnerable. A subject, not a sovereign. Rida welcomed modern tools, the university, the hospital, the telegraph, but warned that these were not value neutral. They could either liberate or colonize, depending on the ethical system that wielded them. Without a firm anchoring in the Quran, modernity risked becoming not a path to progress, but a vehicle for submission. To Western colonial administrators, Rida appeared at first like a promising figure, rational, reformist, anti-violent. He condemned armed revolts that lacked strategy. He supported legal reform, and his Islam sounded, at times, like something that could coexist with empire. But scratch beneath the surface, and a deeper, more radical program emerged. Rida wasn't modernizing Islam to please Europe. He was rearming it, intellectually and spiritually, to resist it. The British and French read Al-Manar carefully. Internal correspondences from the India Office and Foreign Office in this period reveal a growing unease. Some advisors saw Rida as a moderate cleric, useful against what they called fanatic Islam. Others understood what he truly was, a builder of legitimacy. And that was harder to kill than any rebel. Rida's power came not from militancy, but from coherence. He didn't just critique the West. He offered an alternative, a system that didn't mimic Europe's nation-state or its secular materialism, but reclaimed governance as a moral project rooted in revelation and reason. He advocated constitutionalism, not as a European gift, but as a retrieval of early Islamic principles. He reimagined sovereignty, not in terms of empire or ethnicity, but in terms of ummah. By the turn of the century, Rida had established himself as the most influential Islamic thinker of his generation. Not because he shouted loudest, but because he asked better questions. Because he revived not just religious identity, but civilizational vision.
The world around him was still held together by empire, but the cracks had begun to spread. And in those cracks, thinkers like Rida were planting seeds. This period in the 19th century that saw thinkers such as Afghani, Abdu, and Rida was one of the last moments in modern history when the Islamic intellectual tradition tried to heal itself on its own terms, without warlords, without kings, and without foreign mandates. Afghani, Abdu, and Rida weren't asking Muslims to reject modernity. They were asking them to rebuild their own, from within their own tradition. This was an indigenous renaissance, not imported revolution. Rooted in Quranic reasoning, animated by moral clarity, loyal to Islam but not blind to its failures. Each man recognized the same crisis. The Muslim world was being hollowed out, politically, spiritually, and intellectually, by both internal stagnation and foreign domination. Knowing full well how the West was exploiting their civilization, none of them called for bloodshed. None of them turned religion into a machine of vengeance. What they proposed instead was more threatening to empire: thought. They told Muslims to read more, not fight more, to reason, to revive ijtihad, to reform authority, not merely obey it, and to insist that Islam was not the problem, but the only viable framework left to resist exploitation without becoming exploitive themselves. The colonial powers saw this. They knew it, and they turned away. For all the talk, then and now, of modernizing the Muslim world, when faced with a choice, the British didn't invest in men like Abdu. They marginalized them, silenced them, exiled them, stood in their way at every turn. Because what these reformers demanded wasn't mere mimicry of the West. It was moral autonomy, and that was unacceptable. Instead, empire found its preferred partners elsewhere, in the seminaries of Najd, in the tribal courts of Arabia, in ideologies that discouraged dissent, distrusted philosophy, preferred the sword over reason, and reduced Islam to a set of enforcements, not explorations. It didn't produce thinkers, it produced enforcers. And so when empire needed a theology to coexist with its extractive ambitions, it chose the one that didn't ask uncomfortable questions.
The same West that cursed its own intellectual rigidity, that ridiculed its medieval clerics for condemning reason, supported doctrines abroad that did the very same to Islam. When given a chance to cultivate an Islamic world aligned with the values it claimed to champion, intellectual freedom, self-governance, critical inquiry, the West chose the opposite. It didn't just fail to support reform, it helped bury it. What could have been a revival of Islamic thought became a vacuum. And what filled that vacuum wasn't reason, it was rage. Because eventually, when voices like Afghani's were ignored, and channels like Al-Manar were surveilled, and movements like Abdu's were dismembered,
what remained was the silence before the storm. And the storm came from Persia, from a gun in Tehran, and from the wreckage of one empire that was bleeding while another prepared to drill. It's 1890, and as Egypt was hosting intellectual giants like Abdu and Rida, armed with thought instead of violence, further east, Iran's on the edge of something big, a moment where history's weight and the West's hunger collide. To understand this, we need to back up. 1501, Safavids rule Iran. They weren't just kings, they were a revolution, making Shia Islam Iran's heartbeat, building an empire of poetry, art, and defiance. But every redefinition breeds resistance. To the west stood the Ottomans, Sunni, imperial, and armed with a legitimacy the Safavids didn't yet have. The Caliphate saw Iran's Shia turn as a challenge. Wars broke out, such as Chaldiran, 1514, where Ottoman cannons blasted Safavid dreams. That Shia-Sunni split wasn't just about faith. It drew lines in the sand, isolating Iran as the Muslim world's Shia outlier, proud, but alone. By the 19th century, the Safavids are a memory, their empire shattered by invasions and tribal chaos. The Qajars step in, trying to glue Iran back together, but they're no Safavids. They're a shaky dynasty, juggling tribes, clerics, and merchants while the world's powers circle. The Ottomans, still the Muslim world's heavyweight, keep Iran at a distance. Border spats over Shia holy cities like Najaf keep things tense. But the real threat isn't Istanbul, it's Europe. The West got its foot in Iran's door early, back in the 1800s, when Napoleon and Britain started playing chess with the Qajars. France sent advisors in 1807 to cozy up to Iran against British India. Britain hit back with arms and cash in 1809 to keep Iran anti-Russian. By the 1820s, Russia's in the game. The Russo-Persian Wars ended in humiliation. The treaties of Gulistan, 1813, and Turkmenchai, 1828, stripped Iran of vast territories in the Caucasus and opened its markets to Russian and British goods. These aren't just deals, they're the first threads of a web, with Western advisors worming into Iran's military and British merchants eyeing its trade. Fast forward to 1890, and that web's a noose. The Qajars are drowning in debt, just like Egypt under Khedive Ismail. Remember him? His obsession with European-style projects left Egypt owing £100 million by 1875. Iran's not far behind. The Qajars borrow millions from Britain and Russia, estimates say 5 to 10 million by 1890, to fund lavish courts, half-baked armies, and dreams of looking modern. Every loan comes with a catch. Britain gets telegraph lines, river trade. Russia gets northern markets. The 1872 Reuter concession was a low point, giving a single British baron control of Iran's railways, mines, even banks. Iran's sovereignty is slipping, its treasury empty, its people squeezed. Across the Muslim world,
it's the same story. Egypt's a British puppet. India's under the Raj. The Ottomans are buckling under debt and doubt. But in Iran, something's about to snap. Enter the tobacco concession of 1890. Nasser al-Din Shah signs a deal with a British company, the Imperial Tobacco Corporation, handing them a monopoly over Iran's tobacco. Every leaf grown, sold, or exported. The terms are brutal. Britain gets full control for 50 years.
paying Iran a measly £15,000 a year and 25% of profits, while Iranians lose their livelihoods. Tobacco is not just a crop, it's Iran's lifeblood, employing thousands. Farmers in Isfahan, traders in Tabriz, shopkeepers in Shiraz. In 1890, tobacco accounts for roughly 10% of Iran's exports, worth about £500,000 annually. This deal isn't trade, it's theft. A foreign hand ripping out a piece of Iranian culture. The British see dollar signs, securing their empire's supply chain. The Qajars see a quick buck to pay off debts. But the people, they see betrayal. In 1891, Iran explodes. The tobacco revolt is no small protest. It's a full-blown uprising, a tidal wave sweeping up everyone. Merchants shut down bazaars, locking stalls from Tehran to Mashhad. Farmers burn their tobacco crops rather than hand them over. Women, breaking every social norm, hit the streets, hiding pipes and boycotting markets. Even the Shah's harem, his private world, joins in, refusing to smoke. This isn't a top-down rebellion. It's the people. Men, women, rich, poor, saying enough. The spark comes from a Shia cleric, Ayatollah Mirza Shirazi, based in Najaf, Iraq. His fatwa is a bombshell. Using tobacco is a war against the imam. Overnight, Iran's tobacco culture, pipes in tea houses, bundles in markets, grinds to a halt. Mosques turn into command centers, their pulpits ringing with defiance. Protests swell, with tens of thousands marching by early 1892. This isn't just Iran's fight, it's the Muslim world's. Afghani was invited by Nasr al-Din Shah Qajar, who had heard of Afghani's reputation as a brilliant philosopher and reformer. The Shah likely hoped Afghani could help legitimize or modernize his rule. But Afghani, being Afghani, quickly clashed with the Qajar court. His trademark critiques of despotism, clerical stagnation, and foreign concessions did not sit well with Iran's ruling elite. And so, in 1891, just as tensions were rising over the tobacco concession, Afghani was forcibly expelled from Iran. But he left his ideas in Iran, and they were fueling the crowds. By 1892, the Qajars buckle. Nasr al-Din Shah cancels the tobacco concession, a rare win against a global empire. The British are floored. How does a ragtag coalition of clerics, merchants, and women outmaneuver their machine? But here's the sting. Victory's not free. Iran pays £500,000 in compensation to the British company, a crushing blow to an already broke treasury. The Qajars are exposed, weak, wobbling, unable to shield their people. Foreign powers, sensing weakness, pounced harder. Britain and Russia pressed for more. River routes, telegraphs, customs posts, railways. Concession after concession signed behind closed palace doors. The Qajar state becomes less a government, more a brokerage firm, auctioning Iran off piece by piece to pay off mounting loans. But the revolt didn't end with canceled contracts. It ignited a political awakening. In the bazaars, merchants remembered their strength. In the mosques, clerics remembered their authority. In homes across the country, families whispered about change. Yet the Shah learned the opposite lesson, that his survival depended not on reform, but on repression. Afghani's followers, writers, thinkers, merchants, were jailed or silenced. One of them, Mirza Reza Kermani, was beaten brutally, imprisoned for his writings, and left burning with rage. That rage would smolder for 4 years. By 1896, the rot was everywhere. Nasr al-Din Shah had ruled for nearly 50 years. In that time, he had become a symbol of everything broken, a monarch who traveled to Europe for opera and photography while his people starved, a man whose court was drenched in luxury while the countryside was gutted by famine and debt. His European tours, London, Paris, Vienna, weren't diplomacy. They were shopping trips funded by British and Russian loans. The cost? Iran's sovereignty. Iranian farmers were taxed to the bone. The bazaars, once the heart of the tobacco revolt, were gasping under inflation and foreign imports. The political system offered no outlet, no parliament, no elections, no legal recourse. Reformers like Mirza Malcolm Khan, writing from exile, warned that if change didn't come through reason, it would come through fire. That fire came on May 1, 1896. The Shah Abdul-Azim Shrine, just south of Tehran. Nasser al-Din Shah entered to offer prayers. He was unaware that the shrine had become a place of quiet opposition, a gathering space for thinkers, rebels, believers. Waiting inside was Mirza Reza Kermani, the same man his regime had beaten and jailed, now radicalized beyond compromise. As the Shah knelt, Kermani stepped forward. In one swift motion, he pulled out a pistol and fired. The bullet ripped through the air and through history. The Shah collapsed, bleeding onto the shrine's sacred tiles. Kermani didn't flee. He was caught, and during interrogation, made no apology. His act, he said, was for a nation bled dry by foreign hands and domestic betrayal. He named Afghani as his mentor, his inspiration. And suddenly, the regime knew. This wasn't a lone madman. This was political theology turned into revolution. The assassination sent aftershocks through Tehran. Exiled intellectuals spoke of constitutionalism, a majlis, a parliament, to restrain the monarchy and claw back control from foreign banks.
But between vision and change stood an empire-backed system, rigid, relentless, and everywhere. The Shah's assassination sent shockwaves through the court, but not clarity. The Qajar elite didn't pause, didn't rethink. They doubled down. Muzaffar al-Din Shah, who took the throne in 1896, inherited a country bleeding debt and pride. But instead of reform, he chose retreat. Over the next 5 years, he toured Europe 3 times, with grand entourages, shopping sprees, Swiss doctors, French photographers. And every trip was funded not by taxes or trade, but by foreign loans, especially from Russian banks. From 1896 to 1901, he signed ruinous deals. 1896 Russian loans for railways, 1898 Belgian control of customs, 1900 British banking privileges, piling millions more in debt on a nation already bled dry. Forests, fisheries, even tax collection were mortgaged to foreign hands. The people fought back. In 1896 to 1897, Tehran's bazaars shuttered as merchants and women protested, joined by 1900 Tabriz riots, led by Shia cleric Sayyid Jamal al-Din Vaiz, whose sermons fused Islamic justice with calls for a majlis. In Isfahan, crowds chanted for shura-based governance. Mirza Malcolm Khan's newspaper, Qanun, smuggled from London, spread constitutionalist fever, urging a parliament to defy empire. But British advisors pushed 1899 censorship laws, shut Tehran's presses, and installed European ministers, branding reformist cries as sedition. And Iran wasn't alone. Across the Muslim world, the 1890s had stirred hope that empire could be restrained by law and reform could come from within. And by 1896, that hope had matured into a real political idea: constitutionalism. A Muslim parliament. A generation of thinkers who grew up under colonial rule had seen its parliamentary strengths and wanted to adapt it to their own circumstances. In Egypt, occupied since 1882, Abdu was striving. He restructured Sharia courts, expanded Dar al-Ulum's teacher training in 1896, and revived Ijtihad, training students at Al-Azhar to blend Quran with science. But Lord Cromer, Britain's consul since 1883, saw a threat. From 1897, he slashed Al-Azhar's funding by 20%, crippling its reformist programs. In 1898, he blocked Dar al-Ulum's expansion, limiting its enrollment to under 300 students. By 1899, Cromer banned textbooks advocating critical thinking, replacing them with rote religious manuals. Abdu's allies, judges and educators like Qasim Amin, were sidelined from Cairo's courts and ministries, their influence eroded by bureaucratic purges. Meanwhile, apolitical Salafi preachers, once confined to Cairo's fringes, gained ground in mosques like Al-Hussein and Al-Muayyad by 1901. Their sermons urging a return to the Prophet's practices emphasized strict ritual, prayer, dress, personal piety over political defiance or Abdu's intellectual revival.
Its followers shunned constitutionalism, focusing on spiritual purity, which suited Britain's needs. In Damascus, under the heavy hand of Ottoman rule, Abd al-Rahman al-Kawakibi's The Nature of Despotism took shape between 1897 and 1900. Its ideas too dangerous for print. Scrawled in hand-copied manuscripts, his words slipped through the bustling coffeehouses of the old city, passed from scholar to merchant in hushed exchanges. Al-Kawakibi didn't just denounce sultans for their tyranny, he exposed them as puppets, propped up by Britain and France, twin plagues draining the Muslim world's soul. He called for shura-based governance, a system rooted in Islamic consultation, to replace despots with accountability and repel colonial claws. His writings electrified Damascus's intellectual circles, resonating with young reformers who gathered in secret, their debates spilling into the Umayyad mosques' courtyards. By 1898, his ideas reached Rashid Rida in Cairo, whose Al-Manar journal amplified al-Kawakibi's cry for an Islamic renewal, blending tradition with modern governance. Early Arab nationalist circles, like the clandestine literary club formed in 1897, whispered his words, dreaming of a Syria free from Ottoman chains and European schemes. But the empire struck back. Ottoman censors, tipped off by French agents eyeing Syria's fertile lands, raided presses in 1899, seizing manuscripts and smashing printing machines in Damascus's Al-Madan district. By 1901, al-Kawakibi's closest allies, scholars and printers, were arrested, their homes searched, their voices silenced. His call for reform was branded treason, his manuscripts burned in public squares. Al-Kawakibi himself died in 1902, mere months after this crackdown, with whispers of poison swirling among his followers, who suspected Ottoman or French hands. His fuse, lit to spark a revolution of thought, was snuffed out before it could ignite, leaving Damascus's dreamers scattered, and his vision buried under empire's weight.
In British India, the wounds of the 1857 rebellion, harshly blamed on Muslims, still festered, shaping a colonial empire perpetually on guard. From 1896 to 1901, Britain intensified its control over Muslim thought, funneling substantial grants to Deoband's Sunni seminaries, a network founded in 1866, but rapidly expanding in this period to 30 schools across northern India by 1900. These seminaries, centered in Uttar Pradesh, emphasized a rigid curriculum of ritual purity, hadith memorization, fiqh, and strict adherence to Hanafi traditions, deliberately sidelining political engagement or reformist ideas. This was no accident. British administrators, wary of another uprising, saw Deoband's apolitical focus as a bulwark against rebellion, channeling Muslim energy into religious introspection rather than resistance. Meanwhile, the Aligarh movement, led by Sayyid Ahmad Khan until his death in 1898, struggled to sustain its vision of Muslim modernization through Western-style education. Aligarh's Mohammedan Anglo-Oriental College, established in 1875, had flourished by teaching science, English, and Islamic ethics to empower Muslims within the colonial framework. But post-1898, British authorities, suspicious of educated Muslims, slashed funding, forcing the college to raise fees and driving enrollment down from 600 students in 1896 to 400 by 1901. Laboratories once buzzing with experiments stood half-empty, and reformist professors like Theodore Beck faced bureaucratic hurdles. The movement's momentum faltered, its progressive spark dimmed by colonial neglect. While Iran's Shia clerics like Sayyid Jamaldin Vaiz rallied crowds with fiery sermons demanding justice and constitutionalism, India's Sunni Deobandism turned inward, deepening a sectarian divide that Britain quietly exploited. Deoband's clerics, emboldened by colonial grants, issued fatwas against political activism, urging Muslims to focus on personal piety over pan-Islamic unity. This contrasted sharply with earlier reformist currents inspired by Jamaldin Afghani, whose call for Muslim solidarity had once resonated in India. By 1901, Britain's strategy was clear: amplify Deoband's conservative voice to drown out Aligarh's reformist hopes, ensuring Muslims remained fragmented and politically inert. As science labs gathered dust and seminaries multiplied, India's Muslim reformist dreams faded under the weight of colonial manipulation and conservative dogma, sowing seeds of resentment that would later harden into division.
In the Ottoman Empire, Sultan Abdul Hamid II's Pan-Islamism, launched in 1876 to rally Muslims from Morocco to Malaysia, had, by 1896, morphed into a tool of repression. The spirit of the Tanzimat reforms, which had once promised constitutional government, legal equality, and modernization, had all but collapsed under his rule. Where Tanzimat had sought to reconcile Islam with progress and pluralism, Abdul Hamid turned reform on its head. His vision, once hailed as a beacon of unity, had become a facade to tighten his grip on power. Between 1896 and 1901, he invested heavily in symbolic gestures, most notably the 1900 inauguration of the Hijaz Railway linking Damascus to Mecca, and trumpeted as a triumph of Islamic connectivity. Yet behind the fanfare, his regime stifled the very reformist spirit that might have strengthened the Ummah. Reformers like Rashid Rida faced relentless censorship. By 1899, Ottoman authorities banned the distribution of his magazine Al-Manad in Istanbul and Anatolia, seizing copies and harassing readers. Rida's writings, echoing Jamaluddin al-Afghani's dream of a united thinking Islam, were deemed too dangerous for a sultan obsessed with surveillance and control. Meanwhile, the Young Turks, a loose coalition of exiled intellectuals, students, journalists, and disillusioned officers, operated from Paris and Cairo. Though ethnically and religiously diverse, they shared a common goal: to revive the suspended 1876 constitution and re-establish a representative parliament that could limit the palace's authority. Between 1896 and 1901, they flooded the empire with smuggled pamphlets, texts like the 1897 Ottoman Unity Manifesto and the 1899 Hurriyet newsletters, calling on citizens to resist Abdul Hamid's autocracy. But Ottoman intelligence, aided by British and German advisors who preferred a compliant sultan to the uncertainty of reform, responded with force. In 1900, thousands of pamphlets were intercepted in Izmir and Thessaloniki. Presses were destroyed, printers arrested, and underground networks broken. The Young Turks campaign, rooted in Afghani's legacy of political awakening and intellectual freedom, was smothered by surveillance, betrayal, and imperial paranoia. In 1901, Abdul Hamid orchestrated a hollow tribute. Afghani's remains, long neglected after his 1897 death in Istanbul, were reburied with state honors in a grand ceremony. The gesture was empty, a calculated effort to co-opt Afghani's name while burying his vision of free thought and pan-Islamic renewal. Propped up by European powers wary of unrest, Abdul Hamid's regime crushed independent voices. From jailed reformers to banned journals, his leash on Islam, tightened with foreign backing, ensured that the intellectual fire Afghani had kindled was starved of air, leaving only resentment to smolder in its place. In Libya, Italian traders, emboldened by their growing influence since the early 1890s, tightened their economic and political grip on the coastal cities of Benghazi and Derna from 1896 to 1901. The Senussi Order, a Sufi movement rooted in spiritual revival and social cohesion, stood as a bulwark against this encroachment. Led by Sayyid Muhammad al-Mahdi al-Senussi, the order convened tribal councils across Cyrenaica between 1897 and 1900, gathering Bedouin leaders and local notables in mosques from Kufra to Jagabab. Al-Mahdi's sermons wove Islamic mysticism with calls for resistance, urging followers to reject foreign trade monopolies and preserve Libya's autonomy. He established zawiyas, religious lodges that doubled as community hubs, teaching Quranic ethics alongside anti-colonial defiance. But Italy's strategy was insidious. In 1899, they secured a critical Benghazi port lease, pressuring local merchants and tribal sheikhs with bribes and threats to cede land and trading rights. These deals fractured the fragile unity of coastal elites, many of whom, reliant on Italian commerce, began aligning with foreign interests. By 1901, al-Mahdi, facing dwindling support and Italian naval patrols tightening around Derna, relocated his base to the Sahara's remote oases, particularly Kufra. His anti-colonial spark, though dimmed by isolation and elite betrayal, survived in the desert, sowing seeds for the Senussis' later guerrilla campaigns against Italian colonization.
In Central Asia, the jihadist movement, a bold push for Islamic renewal through modern education, gained momentum from 1896 to 1901, seeking to forge an enlightened Islam that could stand against Russian domination. Reformers like Ahmad Danish and Mahmud Khoja Behboudi, inspired by Jamal al-Din Afghani's call for progress, opened dozens of new method schools in Bukhara and Tashkent by 1898. These classrooms buzzed with innovation, teaching mathematics, Persian poetry, geography, and Quranic exegesis side by side, aiming to blend Islamic ethics with modern thought. Behboudi, a fiery scholar in Samarkand, published primers in 1899 that simplified Turkic languages for wider literacy, while Danish's lectures in Bukhara's madrasas urged students to question outdated traditions and embrace science. By 1900, over 20 schools operated, drawing hundreds of students, merchants' sons, artisans, even nomads' children, hungry for a faith that could navigate the modern world. But Russian colonial governors, ruling since the 1860s conquest of Turkestan, saw this awakening as a threat to their iron grip. In 1899, Tashkent schools faced raids. Russian troops stormed classrooms, seizing Behboudi's primers and burning textbooks deemed subversive. By 1900, Bukhara's reformist madrasas were targeted, with teachers like Danish harassed and arrested for inciting unrest. Tsarist decrees banned modern curricula, forcing schools to revert to rote religious instruction. By 1901, only a handful of jihadist classes survived, their enrollment slashed from hundreds to dozens, their progressive flame crushed under Russian repression, leaving a resentful silence that echoed the Muslim world's stifled hopes.
This was the Muslim world's hinge moment. From 1896 to 1901, reformist Islam surged. Tehran's protests, Cairo's schools, Damascus's manuscripts, Benghazi's councils. Fueled by Shura and the very values that the West claimed dear, it threatened not with swords, but with thought. But empire struck back with loans, bans, and division, nurturing Salafi literalism in Egypt, Deobandism in India, Ottoman control, and elite compliance in Libya and Central Asia. As protests swelled and thinkers dared to speak, a new force loomed in 1901, pulling Islam's heartlands deeper into the West's grip. The fight for sovereignty faced a greedier, sharper colonialism, turning hope into smoldering rage. As the 1900s rolled in, strange new machines were rattling to life in the streets of Europe. Smoke-belching cars, oil lamp streetlights, factories that never slept. Europe's industrial empires, Britain, France, Germany, had grown fat on coal, fueling factories, railways, and colonial trade, which turned out 500 million pounds in trade yearly. But coal was heavy, slow, and bound to land. Oil was different. It was compact, portable, and exponentially more powerful. 1 ton equaled 3 tons of coal. In London's Admiralty, Berlin's war rooms, and Paris's ministries, policymakers heard the whispers of scientists and engineers. Oil would drive the next era of war, commerce, and empire. By 1896, Carl Benz's automobiles sputtered across Europe, demanding thousands of gallons daily. The Wright brothers' 1899 gliders hinted at oil-powered flight. Britain's Royal Navy, under Churchill's vision, guarding trade routes worth 200 million pounds through India alone, tested oil boilers by 1898, cutting refueling from 24 hours to 6. A single dreadnought, planned for 1906, would burn 1,000 tons of oil daily, making secure supplies a matter of survival. But Europe's oil was scarce. The United States, producing 51 million barrels in 1899, 60% of global output, held sway through Standard Oil's monopoly, charging premium prices. Russia's Baku fields, 20 million barrels, were locked under Tsarist control, a rival to Britain's ambitions. Whoever controlled oil would control the next war and the next world order. Europe had the navy, the industry, and the capital, but it didn't have the oil.
the Muslim world did. Beneath Persia's Khuzestan deserts, Mesopotamia's plains, Arabia's sands, Libya's dunes, and the Caucasus slopes lay vast reserves of black gold. Geologists like Britain's George Reynolds, surveying Persia in 1894, reported seepages bubbling like springs, hinting at billions of barrels. Unlike America's or Russia's barrels, these lands offered cheap, untapped, controllable wealth. They also sat at empire's choke points, near the Suez Canal, Indian Ocean trade routes, and Russia's frontier, making them economic and strategic prizes. Oil wasn't like cotton or opium. It demanded pipelines, refineries, tankers, and compliance. Occupation was costly, far better to sign a deal with a desperate monarch or fund a loyal cleric. In Persia, the Qajar dynasty, drowning in British and Russian loans, was ripe for exploitation. Shah Muzaffar al-Din, strapped for cash, was an easy mark. By 1899, Britain tapped William Knox D'Arcy, a gold mining tycoon with £1 million in assets, to secure a deal.
A single signature in the opulent yet decaying halls of Tehran's Golestan Palace marked the dawn of a new era of Western domination. In 1901, William D'Arcy sat across from Shah Muzaffar al-Din, a monarch whose sunken eyes and trembling hands revealed his desperation. D'Arcy wasn't an oil man. He was a gold speculator from Australia who'd made a fortune and earned the crown's favor. Backed quietly by the British Admiralty and Foreign Office, he arrived in Persia not as a diplomat or soldier, but as something more dangerous, a gentleman investor. He just needed a signature, and the Shah was ready to sign anything. For a paltry £20,000, less than the cost of a London mansion, and a vague promise of 16% royalties, D'Arcy secured the D'Arcy Concession, granting Britain exclusive rights to explore, drill, and extract oil across 480,000 square miles, an area larger than France and Germany combined, for 60 years. This was the imperialism of the future. No more messy conquests, no more revolts to crush, just contracts, signed by dying kings and enforced by economics. And from the very beginning, it was never about Persia alone. The D'Arcy Concession was a test case. Could the West control Muslim resources through elites, not armies? Could it turn sovereign land into a supply chain? And it worked. This was to become the West's blueprint for a new colonialism, one that crushed Muslim dreams of parliaments, schools, and sovereignty, propping up rigid clerics and loyal rulers to ensure uninterrupted profits.
While Persia was being economically shackled by British oil interests, the heart of Arabia witnessed a more violent resurrection. On a moonless night in January 1902, a 26-year-old exile named Abdulaziz ibn Saud led just 40 men across the desert toward Riyadh, then a dusty outpost under the control of the Al-Rashid, loyal clients of the Ottoman Empire. Their target? The Masmak fortress, an Ottoman garrisoned stronghold guarding the city. As dawn approached, Ibn Saud's men scaled its mud brick walls, killed the Ottoman-appointed governor Ibn Ajlan, and raised the banner of Al Saud once more. Riyadh had fallen, not just to a man, but to a movement. It was the rebirth of the House of Saud. The second Saudi state, established by Turki bin Abdullah in 1824, had collapsed decades earlier. After years of internal strife, it was finally crushed by Ottoman Egyptian forces in 1891. Abdulaziz's father, Abdul Rahman, fled with his family to Kuwait, where the young prince grew up in exile, brooding, learning, waiting. And finally, in 1902, he laid the foundations of what would become the third Saudi state. At Ibn Saud's side, always, was ideology. Wahhabism, a doctrine that preached strict monotheism, condemned Ottoman cosmopolitanism, and branded modern reforms as apostasy. To the British, watching nervously from their outposts in Basra, Muscat, and Bombay, Ibn Saud's victory was an opportunity wrapped in sand.
The Ottoman Empire, though crumbling, still controlled the Red Sea, the Hejaz, and the Persian Gulf, choke points through which millions of pounds in British trade flowed annually. The Ottomans taxed it, monitored it, and above all, still dreamed of revival. London had no appetite for full-scale war. It needed internal dismemberment. And Ibn Saud fit the mold. British agents stationed in Kuwait quickly made contact. They began providing arms, gold, and intelligence, unofficially at first, then through formal treaties by the 1910s. The logic was chillingly pragmatic. Wahhabism was self-sustaining. It required no investment in schools or constitutions. It crushed dissent as heresy. It preached loyalty to the Amir. It was anti-Ottoman, anti-modernist, and immune to pan-Islamic dreams of unity or reform. Where thinkers like Muhammad Abduh in Cairo or the Young Turks in Istanbul pushed for constitutionalism, education, and renewal, Wahhabism offered the opposite: order without questions. In weakening the Ottomans, the British strengthened a regime that, ironically, opposed everything the West claimed to value: reason, liberty, modernization.
Meanwhile, in Algeria, France's colonial grip was tightening with ruthless precision. By 1903, the Constantine decrees had enabled the seizure of over 200,000 acres of fertile land across the eastern provinces, cementing French control over a colony that now supplied 10 million gallons of wine annually, worth £2 million, to France's booming export markets. This was no random redistribution. Prime farmland was handed over to European settlers, the Pieds Noirs, while thousands of Algerian farmers and tribal communities were displaced or forced into marginal lands. The objective was nakedly economic: protect and expand France's colonial lifeline by guaranteeing a steady stream of wine, wheat, and olives, commodities that accounted for nearly 20% of France's total colonial revenues. But to maintain this flow, the colonial regime needed silence, not dissent. Reformist Sufi orders, like the Qadiriya, under leaders such as Sheikh Mohammed al-Hashimi, had begun resisting. In their networks of zawiyas across Constantine and Oran, they preached a fusion of traditional Islamic spirituality with modern ideals: education, legal revival, and cultural resistance. Literacy classes, sermons on dignity, and critiques of French assimilation policies began to attract followers, alarming colonial administrators. In response, the French struck back hard. Qadiriya lodges were raided, their religious endowments confiscated, their teachers jailed. In their place, France propped up pliant tribal chiefs and quietist clerics, men who preached loyalty to the colonial order and discouraged reform. Back in Persia, the Darcy concession was starting to look like a failed gamble.
For several agonizing years, British geologist George Reynolds roamed Persia's southern interior, fighting off disease, tribal raids, unbearable heat, and logistical nightmares. He faced sabotage, infighting with Darcy's London board, and near bankruptcy. By 1904, Burma Oil was losing patience. One executive called it a fool's errand in the sands. The venture was close to collapse. Simultaneously, within Persia, mass protests erupted in the bazaars. Widespread frustration with foreign economic domination, rising taxes to pay European loans, and royal extravagance ignited the first sparks of national awakening. The clergy, merchants, intellectuals, and newly formed women's groups like Anjuman-e-Hurriyat-e-Vatan united in demanding reforms and an end to unaccountable concessions like Darcy's. In 1906, under immense public pressure and fearing a complete uprising, the Shah conceded to reform. He approved the creation of a Majlis, Persia's first parliament, and signed a constitution, launching the Constitutional Revolution. Figures like Saeed Hassan Takazada rose as reformist leaders, demanding national control over resources, curbs on monarchy, and limits on foreign powers. Meanwhile, Darcy's oil drilling still teetered on the edge of failure.
Then, in May 1908, after 7 years of hardship, Reynolds struck oil at Masjid Soliman. It was the first major oil discovery in the Middle East. Gushing crude confirmed Persia's land was unimaginably rich, not just in history, but in energy. In 1909, to manage this treasure, the British created the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, APOC, soon heavily tied to the British government. Though oil now flowed to British refineries and warships, almost none of the profits reached the Persian people. London signed deals with tribal leaders like the Bakhtiari, offering cash and guns in exchange for guarding the pipelines, cutting Persian society out of its own oil economy. Meanwhile, Persia's new democracy was under siege. In 1907, Britain and Russia signed the Anglo-Russian Convention, dividing Persia into spheres of influence, the north to Russia, the oil-rich south to Britain, and the center nominally neutral. Neither power consulted the Majlis. That same year, the aging Muzaffar al-Din Shah died, and his son, Muhammad Ali Shah, took the throne. Hostile to constitutionalism, he aligned with Russia and viewed the Majlis as a threat to royal and foreign control. In 1908, backed by Russian officers and Persian Cossacks, the Shah bombarded the Majlis with artillery, dissolved the constitution, and arrested reformers. Cities like Tabriz resisted, with Takhazada and other revolutionaries leading a prolonged armed stand. But in 1909, Russian troops directly intervened, occupying Tabriz and executing revolutionaries.
Britain, despite preaching liberal ideals, refused to oppose the crackdown, prioritizing APOC's oil operations and stability over democracy. Conservative clerics like Sheikh Fazlullah Nuri, once sympathetic to reform, now declared the constitution un-Islamic and Western. The British subtly amplified these voices to undercut secular nationalism, but Nuri's position backfired. In July 1909, after the Shah was deposed by revolutionary forces and went into exile, Nuri was arrested and publicly hanged by constitutionalists. Briefly, it seemed the revolution might revive, but by 1911, the dream had faded. Russian troops re-entered northern cities. Britain expanded control of the south. The Majlis was dissolved again. APOC, guarded by tribal militias and British gunboats, pumped oil from Persian soil into British tanks, while ordinary Persians lived under occupation and poverty. Takhizadeh was forced into exile. The constitutional revolution had been buried. Not only by monarchs and clerics, but by a global system that viewed Persian sovereignty as an obstacle to empire. While Persia burned under foreign bayonets, further west, in Egypt, the same imperial logic was unfolding. After the death of Muhammad Abdu in 1905, the intellectual fire he had lit at Al-Azhar began to flicker. His dream of an Islam in harmony with modernity was starved of oxygen. Britain had no interest in a reformed Muslim society, only in one that bled cotton and stayed quiet. By now, Egypt's cotton exports were worth over £50 million annually, keeping Manchester's mills spinning and London's empire afloat.
British administrators ruled from Cairo like corporate executives. In June 1906, a detachment of British officers rode into the Nile Delta village of Dinshaway, rifles in hand, shooting pigeons for sport, unaware or unconcerned that those birds were a food source carefully raised by local farmers. A shot rang out, a barn caught fire, a scuffle broke loose, a British officer collapsed. Whether from heat stroke or injury was unclear, but the colonial response was immediate and merciless. To send a message, 52 villagers were rounded up, tried in a kangaroo court dominated by British officials. 4 were hanged, their bodies left dangling in the sun as villagers were forced to watch. Others were flogged or sent to hard labor. Britain wanted Egypt terrified, but it backfired. Dinshaway broke something open. Crowds surged in Cairo's cafes. Students marched through Al-Azhar's courtyards. Dock workers in Alexandria refused to unload British cargo. Across the country, Dinshaway became a symbol, not just of cruelty, but of economic betrayal. Egyptians saw clearly, their lives were worth less than the pigeons fattening Britain's leisure class. Huda Sha'arwi, a rising aristocrat and reformer, stepped into this vacuum with lectures that married Islamic ethics with national revival and women's education. But British officials moved quickly.
Her salons were surveilled, her allies leaned on, her public gatherings denied permits. Cairo's feminist current, like its modernist one, was boxed in and sidelined. Into the intellectual vacuum stepped a different current, one that abandoned reform for reaction. The Salafi revival, once marginal, now surged under the pen of Rashid Rida, Abdu's student turned critic, who blamed Egypt's humiliation not on colonialism alone, but on moral decline and innovation in religion. The new generation listened. They saw Britain's gallows, their elders' silence, and the failure of moderation. And they turned, not toward reform, but toward purity. Dinshué had done more than kill 4 villagers. It had buried Egypt's best hope for a reconciled Islam and modernity. And in its place, it had planted a seed of Puritanism that would, in time, grow teeth.
In Syria, too, the tide of reform was receding.
In 1902, one of its boldest minds, Abdurrahman al-Kawakibi, was silenced. A champion of Arab dignity and Islamic unity, his 1900 book, al-Qura, envisioned a revitalized Islamic caliphate, blending faith with modern governance to unite Muslims from Damascus to Mecca. His 1902 work, Tabi al-Istibdad, The Nature of Tyranny, condemned autocratic rule, both Ottoman and Western, as a shackle on Muslim progress. His calls for decentralized governance and intellectual revival threatened the Ottoman Sultan's control and the economic interests of European powers eyeing Syria's fertile trade routes, which funneled millions in grain, silk, and cotton to European markets. Kawakibi's death silenced a beacon of Arab Islamic unity, leaving his followers adrift in a region increasingly carved up for profit. In Damascus, intellectuals like Muhammad Kurd Ali and members of the secret Al-Fatat Society gathered in coffee houses, drafting manifestos for Arab autonomy within a reformed Ottoman framework. These reformers sought constitutional governance, inspired by Kawakibi's writings, and the 1908 Young Turk Revolution's promise of change. Though still officially Ottoman, Syria was now riddled with French investment, and France wasn't interested in reform. France, with its eyes on Syria's £5 million annual trade, grain from Homs, silk from Aleppo, and access to the Suez Canal route, saw Arab nationalism as a threat to its economic ambitions. French consuls in Damascus quietly supported Ottoman authorities, who arrested dozens of Al-Fatat members in 1908, accusing them of sedition. By 1913, the Ottoman government executed 11 Arab nationalists in Damascus's central square, a public warning that reform and attempts at aligning Islam with modernity would not be tolerated. These crackdowns, backed by French trade interests, crushed hopes of a reformed, united Arab polity, pushing activists underground and fueling resentment against both Ottoman and Western overlords. Amid this repression, Shakib Arslan, a Lebanese Druze poet and intellectual, emerged as a voice for Muslim revival. From his base in Geneva, Arslan's 1910 to 1914 writings called for a pan-Islamic renaissance, urging Muslims to reclaim their intellectual and political strength while preserving faith. He envisioned a confederation of Muslim states, modern, yet rooted in Islamic principles, capable of resisting Western economic domination. But France, already plotting Syria's division through the 1916 Sykes-Picot Agreement, dismissed Arslan's vision. French investors, holding £10 million in Ottoman railway and port bonds, needed a fragmented Levant to secure markets and future oil prospects in Mosul and Kirkuk. Arslan's writings were banned. Suppression of Syria's reformists served Western economic goals, but planted seeds of rage as disillusioned intellectuals and clerics began turning to more militant visions of resistance. India, another imperial prize, was being methodically splintered. Britain was engineering divisionist strategy. London's economic hold on the subcontinent, worth over £100 million annually in trade, depended on keeping Muslims and Hindus from marching in unison. The instrument: divide and delegate. By 1906, British officials orchestrated the formation of the All India Muslim League, led by loyalist elites like Aga Khan III, a wealthy Ismaili leader, and Nawab Vikar-ul-Mulk, a landed aristocrat, to counter the Indian National Congress's growing nationalist push for self-rule. The League,
framed as a defender of Muslim interests, was a British-engineered wedge, drawing elite Muslims into a narrow, apolitical loyalty to the crown. This elitist ideology, prioritizing privilege over mass mobilization, ensured Muslims remained divided, unable to challenge Britain's grip on India's markets, which generated £20 million in railway revenues alone. Its structure, rigid, urban, elite, offered no space for peasants, artisans, or the ulema, stifling broader anti-colonial unity. It was a velvet rope around Muslim political life. Meanwhile, Aligarh's modernist schools, founded by Sir Syed Ahmad Khan to fuse Islamic scholarship with Western science and produce a reformist Muslim intelligentsia, withered. In its place, Britain funneled resources into 30 Deobandi seminaries by 1910. Their Islam was deliberate, textual, and quietist. There were no lectures on constitutionalism, no flirtations with pan-Islam, only ritual, jurisprudence, and inward discipline. By 1910, Deobandi fatwas explicitly condemned nationalist agitation, branding it un-Islamic. Britain had effectively neutralized India's Muslim street. On one end, the League's aristocratic loyalism, on the other, Deoband's theological retreat. Together, they kept Muslims politically fragmented, intellectually boxed, and economically exploited. All while Britain's profits soared, port duties alone raking in £10 million annually. Colonial taxes doubled from 1901 to 1914, yet rural wages stagnated. Artisans drowned under floods of British imports. Famine relief dried up, redirected to London's imperial balance sheets. Rural debt spiked 25%, and no one spoke for the masses. Yet under this suffocation, a different voice stirred. Muhammad Iqbal, a poet with fire in his pen, rejected both elite loyalism and theological withdrawal. In his 1904 Tarana-e-Hindi, he envisioned a united, reawakened Muslim identity. But British officials, allergic to anything pan-Islamic or popular,
dismissed him as sentimental and impractical. The British strategy was consistent: fragment, isolate, and rule. Just as they engineered elite Muslim loyalism through the League and theological retreat through Deoband, they deepened communal fissures through the partition of Bengal in 1905, slicing the region along religious lines to undercut growing Hindu-Muslim unity. Language, too, became a battleground. The Urdu-Hindi controversy, inflamed under colonial oversight, turned script and speech into markers of division. These moves weren't improvisations. They were calculated reinforcements of a larger imperial design: keep the colonized divided. The same design was unfolding westward, in the heartlands of the Ottoman Empire, now dubbed the sick man of Europe. In 1908, the streets of Istanbul surged with euphoric crowds, waving banners of liberty, shouting slogans of constitutional renewal. After 3 decades of autocracy under Sultan Abdulhamid II, the empire's slumbering constitution, first introduced in 1876 and shelved almost immediately, was forcefully resurrected by a popular force, the Young Turks. Led by the Committee of Union and Progress, CUP, figures like Enver Pasha, Talat Pasha, and Cemal Pasha seized the political moment. The committee offered a vision: parliamentary rule, ethnic equality, economic modernization. In theory, this was to be a pan-Islamic modernity, a revival of the empire's Islamic identity fused with constitutionalism and science. But in the wings stood 2 empires, Britain and Germany, both ready to hijack the dream. Ottoman ports like Izmir, Salonika, and Basra were already moving over £50 million worth of goods annually, and neither empire would allow the Ottoman state to grow strong enough to interfere with their investments. The Young Turks were swiftly courted, offered loans, weapons, and trade deals that came laced with invisible strings. Berlin built railways, London extended credit, and behind every gesture lay a simple demand: stay open to foreign capital and don't tamper with the extraction economy. Then came 1909. A counter-revolt erupted in Istanbul, staged by religious conservatives and loyalists to Abdulhamid, who feared the Young Turks' reforms would erode Islamic authority. What followed was chaos and an opportunity. Britain and Germany, pretending to uphold stability, sent advisors, aid, and influence to help the Young Turks crush the uprising. They succeeded, but the cost was high. Abdulhamid's coup was deposed, exiled to Thessaloniki, and the last symbol of the caliphate's religious prestige was neutralized. The Young Turk regime survived, but its soul was compromised. Pan-Islamism faded as the new government leaned on secular Turkish nationalism to appease European creditors. In Central Asia, Russia clamped down with an iron fist to safeguard Baku's oil fields, which pumped 20 million barrels annually by 1908, generating 10 million pounds in profits critical to the Tsarist economy. The region's Muslim communities, from Tashkent to Bukhara, were stirring with reformist zeal through the Jihadist movement. By 1908, over 100 Jihadist schools dotted Turkestan, challenging Russia's control by fostering a generation that questioned imperial rule. But Russia, prioritizing oil revenues and trade routes to Persia and China, saw reform as a threat. Tsarist governors launched crackdowns, closing dozens of schools in Tashkent and Samarkand, confiscating presses and arresting teachers. The suppression fueled resentment, planting seeds of resistance. And the story wasn't confined to the steppes. Morocco, long perched on the edge of empires, was finally carved up in 1912. The Treaty of Fez turned it into a French protectorate, sealing Paris's grip over the trade arteries that pumped North African grain, leather, and phosphate into European factories. France moved fast to insulate its economic pipeline, installing puppet sultans, bribing tribal chiefs, and securing monopolies for firms like Compagnie Marocaine, which now controlled the phosphate mines and cereal exports. But under the radar, a new generation of scholars, most famously Alal al-Fasi, began merging Islamic revival with national liberation. They demanded ijtihad, independent reasoning, and modern schooling grounded in Islam. Colonial officials, wary of losing control over a territory that generated millions in annual exports, cracked down. The French promoted tame Sufi orders, quietist, apolitical, and focused on mysticism, not mobilization. Morocco's emerging reform movement was neutered. Half a world away, in the sprawling Dutch East Indies, the stakes were just as high. The Netherlands sat atop a commercial empire worth billions. Rubber, coffee, spices, and tin, extracted from an archipelago governed through force and favoritism. In this system, Islam was tolerated only if it stayed docile. But in 1912, a shockwave hit Java. Ahmad Dahlan, a young reformer deeply influenced by Egyptian modernists like Muhammad Abdu, founded Muhammadiyya in Yogyakarta. Through schools, clinics, and printing presses, Muhammadiyya aimed to produce a modern Muslim society. Within years, Muhammadiyya had opened dozens of schools, reaching thousands. The colonial government responded by tightening the leash. Publications were censored, funding was blocked, and Java's native aristocracy, the Priyayi, long co-opted by the Dutch, were enlisted to smear the movement as radical. In Iraq, the battleground wasn't the madrasa, it was the oil field. Britain was, by 1911, heavily relying on oil. British geologists operating under the pretense of scientific exploration began surveying Mosul's Kirkuk region. Surface seepages had hinted at something vast, reserves potentially rivaling even Persia's Khuzestan fields. Within a decade, Kirkuk's fields were expected to generate over 5 million pounds annually, helping Britain anchor its grip on Ottoman trade routes worth 4 times that. This economic incursion came at a cost. Local agency. Reformist currents, especially in Basra under figures like Sayyid Talib al-Naqib, had begun articulating visions of economic autonomy and Arab self-rule. But with oil on the horizon, Britain could not afford nationalist voices. The Ottomans, eager to avoid confrontation and preserve ties with London, marginalized Talib and his circles, sacrificing reform for British favor. In the Persian Gulf, empire was cloaked in treaty parchment. The 1901 Bahrain Treaty and a string of Kuwait deals from 1899 to 1913 granted Britain de facto control over shipping lanes, ports, and lucrative pearl fisheries, transforming the Gulf into a security corridor between India and Europe. Britain propped up tribal hierarchies, the Al-Khalifa in Bahrain and Mubarak al-Sabah in Kuwait. But the empire's shadow stretched even farther, to the jagged highlands of Afghanistan. For centuries, Afghanistan had been a buffer state, wedged between Russian ambition and British paranoia. It was a tribal tapestry of Pashtun, Tajik, and Hazara confederacies, ruled by honor codes and lineage loyalties. Since the late 19th century, Britain had viewed it as a critical frontier, a geographic hinge between India's riches and Russian hunger. By the early 1900s, the world was changing. Railways, telegraphs, and newspapers were redrawing the very idea of governance. A new elite was emerging in Kabul, educated, urban, and exposed to reformist ideas circulating from Istanbul to Cairo. Though officially neutral in the great game between Britain and Russia, Afghanistan under King Habibullah Khan was anything but sovereign. The British, having suffered humiliating defeats in 2 prior wars, had shifted strategies. No longer chasing outright conquest, they adopted a more insidious approach: control through containment. Under the guise of diplomacy, British officials stationed in India closely monitored Kabul. They extended subsidies to the Afghan court, but with strings attached. The 1905 Anglo-Afghan Agreement reinforced this, with Britain handling Afghanistan's external affairs in exchange for subsidies. The aim was simple: preserve the status quo. Reform was seen as a threat. Any attempt to modernize Afghanistan, especially in ways that centralized authority, undermined tribal power, or secularized education, was quietly discouraged. In tribal regions, British agents built alliances with conservative religious leaders and local chieftains, reinforcing traditional authority structures that were resistant to change. As a result, madrasas flourished, while secular education remained stunted. Jirgas, Sharia councils, and tribal codes retained their grip on Afghan society. In the shadows of empire, a quiet pact had been struck: empower the clerics, arm the tribal chiefs, and freeze Afghanistan in time. Despite the monumental opposition it faced from the imperial West across the Muslim world, intellectuals and clerics were attempting to stitch together a modernized Islamic civilization. Sophisticated thinkers proposing constitutional governments, pan-Islamic alliances, and economic cooperation. Their goal was to awaken the Ummah, to build telegraph lines that connected Algiers to Lahore, to coordinate railways, educational exchanges, and diplomatic unity, to show that Islam could be modern without being colonized. And the West noticed the Ottoman Sultan's symbolic role as caliph still carried weight, especially in British colonies. So the British diplomats pressured Ottoman officials to disavow these reformist movements. They warned of diplomatic consequences should Istanbul lend it any real support. Why? Because a unified Muslim bloc threatened the architecture of empire. British-led global trade across the Muslim world was worth over £500 million annually. Reform meant sovereignty. Sovereignty meant tariffs. Tariffs meant lost profit. Thus, on the eve of the First World War, the Muslim world stood broken, exhausted, and hijacked. From Persian oil to Indian jute, Algerian cotton to Moroccan phosphates, its resources were sucked dry, funneled into European markets to feed industries and empires it would never benefit from. The West had deliberately and systematically silenced all moderate voices of reform, leaving only the extremes, those who twisted religion into reaction, to fill the vacuum. And now, the Muslim world was about to be dragged into its most tragic chapter yet, into a war it did not start, over alliances it did not sign, for empires it did not serve.